In the glittering world of Manila's elite, a young Filipina bride named Maria thought she had found her fairy tale. But on a quiet afternoon, while tidying her husband Antonio's study, she stumbled upon a document that shattered her dreams, a secret will that would leave her with nothing. Shocked and betrayed, Maria's world crumbled around her. Yet in that moment of despair, a fire ignited within her. Determined to uncover the truth, Maria began to dig deeper into Antonio's life. What she found was a web of lies, hidden bank accounts, and shameless infidelity. Her wealthy husband, it seemed, had been playing a dangerous game all along, but Maria refused to be a pawn in his schemes. With steely resolve, she hatched a plan for revenge, meticulously gathering evidence and biding her time. Maria prepared for the ultimate confrontation. Antonio's lavish birthday dinner would be the stage for her grand reveal, a night that would change everything. As the fateful evening approached, tension mounted. Maria's heart raced with anticipation and fear. Would her carefully laid plans succeed, or would Antonio's influence and cunning prevail? With everything on the line, Maria steeled herself for the performance of a lifetime. Before we dive into this thrilling tale of betrayal and revenge, buckle up, get ready, and subscribe for a special surprise tomorrow. The Manila Cathedral stood resplendent in the late afternoon sun, its grand facade a testament to centuries of faith and tradition. Today, it bore witness to a union that seemed destined by the stars themselves, the wedding of Maria Santos and Antonio Reyes. Maria, a vision in white, stood at the entrance, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and nerves. At 25, she was about to embark on a journey she had only dreamed of as a young girl growing up in the provinces. Her simple upbringing was a stark contrast to the opulence that surrounded her now, but she held her head high, determined to embrace this new chapter of her life with grace and dignity. As the church doors swung open, the assembled guests turned to catch their first glimpse of the bride. Maria took a deep breath, clutching her bouquet of white roses, and began her walk down the aisle. The cathedral's interior was a masterpiece of marble and gold, adorned with countless flickering candles and fragrant flowers. But all eyes were on Maria as she glided forward, her gown a cascade of delicate lace and shimmering beads. At the altar stood Antonio Reyes, every inch the successful businessman in his impeccably tailored tuxedo. At 40, he cut a distinguished vigor, his salt and pepper hair and confident smile speaking of a man accustomed to power and respect. As Maria approached, his eyes lit up with unmistakable admiration and pride. The ceremony proceeded with all the pomp and circumstance befitting Manila's elite. Vows were exchanged, rings slipped onto fingers, and at last, the newlyweds sealed their union with a kiss. As they turned to face their guests, a thunderous applause filled the cathedral, echoing off the vaulted ceilings and stained glass windows. The reception that followed was nothing short of extravagant. Held at one of Manila's most prestigious hotels, it was a showcase of wealth and influence. Crystal chandeliers cast a warm glow over tables laden with gourmet delicacies and vintage champagne. A string quartet played softly in the background as guests mingled, their conversations a mix of congratulations and subtle networking. Maria found herself at the center of attention, graciously accepting well wishes from people whose names and faces blurred together in a whirlwind of introductions. She clung to Antonio's arm, grateful for his steady presence as they navigated the crowd. Despite the overwhelming nature of it all, she couldn't help but feel a surge of excitement. This was her new world, and she was determined to embrace it fully. As the evening wore on, Maria had a moment to herself, stepping out onto a balcony for a breath of fresh air. The Manila skyline stretched out before her, a glittering tapestry of lights against the night sky. She closed her eyes, savoring the cool breeze on her skin and the distant sounds of the city below. A warm hand on her shoulder startled her from her reverie. She turned to find Antonio smiling down at her, his eyes twinkling with affection. "Are you happy, my love?" he asked, pulling her close. Maria nodded, leaning into his embrace. "Yes," she replied softly. "It's all so beautiful, like a dream." Antonio chuckled, placing a gentle kiss on her forehead. "This is just the beginning, Maria. I promise you a life beyond your wildest dreams." As they rejoined the party, Maria's heart swelled with hope and love. She had no way of knowing that beneath the surface of this fairy tale beginning, darker currents were already in motion, ones that would test her in ways she could never have imagined. imagined. The days following the wedding, as Maria settled into her new life, the Reyes family's mansion in Forbes Park was a world away from the modest home she had grown up in. Marble floors, priceless artwork, and a staff of servants were now part of her daily reality. At first, Maria felt overwhelmed by the sheer grandeur of it all, but she was determined to adapt quickly. Antonio was attentive and patient, guiding her through the intricacies of their new shared life. He introduced her to the household staff, showed her around the sprawling property, and helped her navigate the complexities of their social calendar. Maria was grateful for his support, even as she struggled to find her footing in this unfamiliar terrain. One morning, about a week after their return from their honeymoon in the Maldives, Maria decided to explore the house on her own. Antonio had left early for a business meeting, leaving her to her own devices. She wandered through the various rooms, still in awe of the luxury that surrounded her. As she passed Antonio's home office, something caught her eye. The door was slightly ajar, and a shaft of sunlight illuminated a corner of his imposing mahogany desk. Maria hesitated for a moment, feeling a twinge of guilt at the thought of entering without permission. But curiosity got the better of her, and she gently pushed the door open. The office was a testament to Antonio's success. Floor-to-ceiling bookshelves lined one wall, filled with leather-bound volumes and industry awards. A large window offered a view of the manicured gardens below. Maria's gaze was drawn to the desk, its surface neat and organized. She ran her fingers lightly over the smooth wood, marveling at the craftsmanship. As she did so, her hand brushed against a folder tucked partially under a stack of papers. The tab on the folder read, "Last Will and Testament Draft." Maria's heart skipped a beat. She knew she shouldn't look, that this was a private matter, but a nagging voice in the back of her mind urged her on. With trembling hands, she opened the folder and began to read. As her eyes scanned the document, Maria's world tilted on its axis. The will, dated just a month before their wedding, laid out Antonio's wishes in stark legal language. To her horror, she discovered that in the event of his death, the bulk of his estate would be divided among his siblings and various charitable organizations. Maria herself was mentioned only in passing, set to receive a modest stipend that would hardly support the lifestyle she had just begun to experience. Shock gave way to disbelief, then to a deep, gnawing hurt. Why would Antonio do this? They had just taken vows, promised to share their lives together. Was this all a sham? 1,000 questions raced through Maria's mind as she stared at the damning document in her hands. The sound of a car pulling up outside snapped Maria back to reality. Hastily, she replaced the folder exactly as she had found it and hurried out of the office, closing the door behind her. She made it to the living room just as Antonio walked in, his face lighting up at the sight of her. "Maria, my love," he greeted her warmly, leaning in for a kiss. "How was your morning?" Maria forced a smile, her mind reeling from what she had just discovered. "Fine," she managed to say, her voice sounding strangely distant to her own ears. "Just relaxing at home." Antonio nodded, seemingly oblivious to her inner turmoil. "I have a surprise for you," he announced, his eyes twinkling with excitement. "We've been invited to the governor's charity gala next week. It's the perfect opportunity to introduce you to some important people." As Antonio continued to talk about the upcoming event, Maria's thoughts were elsewhere. The woman who had walked down the aisle just weeks ago, full of hope and love, was gone. In her place stood someone new, someone wary and determined to uncover the truth behind her husband's deception. That night, as they prepared for bed, Maria watched Antonio with new eyes. His every gesture, every word now seemed suspect. As he kissed her goodnight and drifted off to sleep, Maria lay awake, her mind churning with possibilities and plans. She knew she couldn't confront Antonio directly, not without more information. If she was to protect herself and understand the full scope of his deceit, she would need to be careful, patient, and above all, cunning. The game had changed, and Maria was determined not to be merely a pawn in Antonio's machinations. As the first light of dawn crept through the curtains, Maria made a silent vow to herself. She would uncover every secret, every lie, and when the time was right, she would use that knowledge to secure her future. The naive bride was gone. In her place, a woman ready to fight for what was rightfully hers. The weeks following Maria's discovery of Antonio's secret will were a delicate balancing balancing act. On the surface, she maintained the facade of a blissful newlywed, throwing with enthusiasm. She attended charity events on Antonio's arm, charmed his business associates at dinner parties, and began to navigate the complex social hierarchy of Manila's elite with growing confidence. But beneath this carefully cultivated image, Maria's mind was constantly at work. She observed Antonio closely, noting his habits, his routines, and the small inconsistencies in his behavior that she might have previously overlooked. The way he would step out to take phone calls during dinner, claiming they were urgent business matters, the late nights at the office that seemed to be becoming more frequent, the hushed conversations with his secretary that would abruptly end when Maria entered the room. Each of these moments, insignificant on their own, began to form a pattern in Maria's mind. She knew she needed more concrete evidence, but these observations fueled her determination to uncover the truth. One evening, as they prepared for yet another social engagement, Maria decided to test the waters. As Antonio adjusted his tie in the mirror, she casually mentioned a news story she had seen about estate planning. "It got me thinking," she said, keeping her tone light and curious. "Have you ever considered updating your will, darling? Now that we're married, I mean." Antonio's reflection in the mirror stiffened almost imperceptibly before he turned to her with a warm smile. "Oh, there's no need to worry about such things, my love. Everything's taken care of. Shall we go? We don't want to be late." His deflection only confirmed Maria's suspicions. As they descended the grand staircase of their mansion, her mind was already formulating a plan. She needed access to Antonio's financial records, his correspondence, anything that could give her a clearer picture of what she was up against. The opportunity presented itself sooner than she expected. A week later, Antonio announced he would be traveling to Singapore for a business conference. It would be his first trip away since their wedding, and he seemed almost apologetic as he broke the news over breakfast. "I'll only be gone for 3 days," he assured her, reaching across the table to squeeze her hand. "Will you be all right on your own, my dear?" Maria summoned her most convincing smile. "Of course, Antonio. I'll miss you, but I understand how important your work is. Perhaps I'll use the time to get to know some of the other wives better." Antonio beamed at her understanding. "That's my girl. I knew you'd fit right in here." As soon as Antonio's car disappeared down the driveway on the morning of his departure, Maria sprang into action. She had 3 days, and she intended to make the most of them. Her first stop was Antonio's home office. With trembling hands, she booted up his computer. To her dismay, it was password protected. She tried a few combinations: their wedding date, Antonio's birthday, even the name of his childhood dog that he had once mentioned. Nothing worked. Frustrated but not defeated, Maria turned her attention to the filing cabinets. Most of the documents inside were business-related and beyond her comprehension, but she photographed everything that looked important with her phone, determined to decipher them later. It was in the bottom drawer, buried beneath a stack of old tax returns, that she found something interesting. Bank statements from an account she had never seen before. The balance was substantial, far more than Antonio had ever mentioned having. In liquid assets, Maria's heart raced as she flipped through the statements. Regular large deposits, always from the same offshore company, withdrawals to unknown recipients. It was all there in black and white, a paper trail of deception. She was so engrossed in her discovery that she almost didn't hear the front door open. Panic seized her as she realized someone had entered the house. Hastily, she shoved the statements back into the drawer and straightened up the office, her pulse pounding in her ears. "Mrs. Reyes," a voice called out. It was Eleanor, the housekeeper. "Are you home?" Maria took a deep breath, willing her voice to sound normal. "Yes, Elena, I'm in the study. I'll be right out." She gave the office one last sweeping glance to ensure everything was in place, then stepped out, closing the door firmly behind her. Elena stood in the hallway, a look of mild surprise on her face. "I'm sorry, Mom. I didn't mean to startle you. I thought you might have gone out." Maria forced a laugh. "Oh no, just catching up on some reading. Antonio's always encouraging me to take an interest in his business affairs." Elena nodded, seemingly satisfied with the explanation. As the housekeeper bustled off to begin her daily tasks, Maria retreated to her bedroom, her mind whirling with the implications of what she had found. The next 2 days passed in a blur of covert investigation and mounting anxiety. anxiety. Maria scoured every inch of the house. Additional clues. She found a burner phone hidden in the back of Antonio's sock drawer, its call log filled with a single recurring number. In his walk-in closet, behind a row of designer suits, she discovered a small safe. Without the combination, she could only speculate about its contents, but its very existence spoke volumes. On the afternoon of Antonio's return, Maria sat in their bedroom, staring at her reflection in the vanity mirror. The woman who looked back at her seemed different somehow, older, wiser, with a hardness in her eyes that hadn't been there before. She heard the front door open, followed by Antonio's voice calling out her name. Taking a deep breath, Maria stood, smoothing down her dress and plastering on a welcoming smile. She had played the role of the perfect wife for weeks. Now she would have to give the performance of her life. "Welcome home, darling," she greeted Antonio as she descended the stairs. He enveloped her in a warm embrace, pressing a kiss to her cheek. "I missed you," he murmured into her hair. "How was your time alone? Did you keep yourself busy?" Maria pulled back, meeting his gaze with a bright smile that didn't quite reach her eyes. "Oh, you know me. I always find ways to occupy myself." As they settled into their usual routine, sharing a drink on the terrace while Antonio regaled her with stories from his trip, Maria's mind was elsewhere. She now knew without a shadow of a doubt that the man she had married was not who he claimed to be. The question that remained was, what was she going to do about it? That night, as Antonio slept peacefully beside her, Maria lay awake, her thoughts racing. She knew she needed more information, more concrete evidence of Antonio's misdeeds, but how far was she willing to go to get it? And once she had it, what then? The path ahead was fraught with danger and uncertainty. One wrong move could alert Antonio to her suspicions and jeopardize everything. But the alternative, remaining in the dark and potentially losing everything she had gained, was unthinkable. As the first light of dawn began to filter through the curtains, Maria made her decision. She would continue her investigation, no matter the cost. She would uncover every secret, every lie, and when the time was right, she would use that knowledge to secure her future. The game had changed, and Maria was determined not to be merely a pawn in Antonio's machinations. She was playing for keeps now, and she intended to win. The following weeks saw Maria embarking on a meticulous and clandestine investigation into Antonio's affairs. She knew she needed to be careful to avoid arousing suspicion while gathering as much information as possible. It was a delicate balance, one that required all of her intelligence and newfound cunning. Her first step was to familiarize herself with the basics of finance and business law. Under the guise of taking an interest in Antonio's work, she began reading financial newspapers and business journals. She even enrolled in an online course in business administration, telling Antonio it was to help her better understand his world. "I'm so proud of you, my dear," Antonio had said, beaming with approval when she told him about the course. "It's important for a woman in your position to be well informed." Little did he know that Maria's education had a far more specific purpose. Armed with her growing knowledge, she began to make sense of the documents she had discovered in Antonio's office. The offshore accounts, the shell companies, the irregular transactions all began to form a clearer picture of Antonio's financial dealings. But Maria knew she needed more. She needed access to Antonio's digital life, to the emails and messages that might reveal the full extent of his deception. The password-protected computer in his office still eluded her, a fortress of secrets she had yet to breach. The opportunity she had been waiting for came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Antonio had left for a business lunch, expecting to be gone for several hours. As soon as his car pulled out of the driveway, Maria made her way to his office, determination etched on her face. She sat at his desk, staring at the login screen of his computer. She had tried every combination she could think of, but nothing had worked. As she was about to give up, her eyes fell on a framed photo on the desk. It was a picture of Antonio as a young man, standing proudly next to a sleek sports car. On a hunch, Maria typed in the make and model of the car, followed by the year. The computer sprang to life, granting her access to Antonio's digital world. Her hands trembling with a mixture of excitement and fear, Maria began to explore. She opened his email client, scanning through messages, her eyes widening as she uncovered correspondence that confirmed her worst suspicions. There were emails discussing hidden accounts in the Cayman Islands, communications with the and most damning of all, intimate exchanges with Antonio's secretary that left no doubt about about the nature of their relationship. Maria's chest tightened as she read through the messages. The betrayal cut deep, but she forced herself to focus. She couldn't let emotions cloud her judgment now. Quickly, she forwarded key emails to a secret account she had set up, ensuring she had copies of everything incriminating. As she was about to log out, a notification popped up on the screen. It was a calendar reminder for a meeting later that week at a hotel across town. The attendee was listed simply as V. Maria's mind raced. Could this be a rendezvous with the secretary? Or was it something else entirely? She made a mental note of the date and time, determined to find out. Just as she was closing everything down, ensuring she left no trace of her presence, she heard the sound of a car pulling up outside. Panic surged through her as she realized Antonio had returned early. With lightning speed, she logged out of the computer and rushed out of the office. She had barely made it to the living room when the front door opened and Antonio walked in, shaking rain from his umbrella. "Maria, darling," he called out, "are you home?" Taking a deep breath to steady herself, Maria stepped into the foyer, a placid smile on her face. "Welcome back, my love. How was your lunch?" As Antonio chatted about his meeting, completely unaware of what had transpired in his absence, Maria's mind was elsewhere. She now had concrete evidence of Antonio's duplicity, but she knew it wasn't enough. She needed to understand the full scope of his deception, to uncover every secret before she could decide her next move. That night, as they prepared for bed, Antonio noticed Maria seemed distracted. "Is everything all right, my dear?" he asked, concern etched on his face. "You've been quiet this evening?" Maria looked up at him, studying the face of the man she had thought she knew. How easily the lies seemed to come to him, how perfectly he played the role of the devoted husband. In that moment, she realized just how much she had changed since their wedding day. The naive, trusting bride was gone, replaced by a woman who understood the power of secrets and deception. "I'm fine," she assured him, summoning a warm smile. "Just a bit tired. I think I'll turn in early." As Antonio kissed her goodnight and settled into bed beside her, Maria lay awake, her mind churning with plans and possibilities. She thought about the mysterious meeting in Antonio's calendar, wondering what new revelations it might bring. She thought about the evidence she had gathered, safely stored away where Antonio would never find it. But mostly, she thought about the future, a future that until recently she had believed was secure and filled with love. Now that future was uncertain, shrouded in lies and betrayal. But Maria was no longer afraid. She was angry, determined, and more than ready to fight for what was rightfully hers. As the first light of dawn began to creep through the curtains, Maria made a silent vow. She would see this through to the end, whatever it took. She would uncover every last secret, expose every lie, and when the time was right, she would turn the tables on Antonio in a way he never saw coming. The game was far from over. In fact, for Maria, it had only just begun. The day of Antonio's mysterious meeting arrived, and Maria was prepared. She had spent the previous days meticulously planning her approach, knowing that this could be a crucial turning point in her investigation. As Antonio left for work that morning, briefcase in hand and a distracted kiss on her cheek, Maria set her plan in motion. She had told Antonio she would be spending the afternoon at a charity luncheon, a convenient alibi that would give her the freedom she needed. Instead, dressed in a nondescript outfit and large sunglasses, Maria made her way to the hotel where the meeting was scheduled to take place. The lobby of the Makati Shangri-La was a hive of activity, business people and tourists milling about in equal measure. Maria found a discreet spot near the bar, ordering a coffee and settling in to wait. Her heart raced with anticipation and fear, knowing that at any moment she might see something that would change everything. At precisely 2 p.m., Antonio strode into the lobby, looking impeccable in a tailored suit. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she watched him scan the room before making his way to the elevator. She waited a few moments before following, her hands trembling slightly as she pressed the button for the same floor she had seen Antonio select. The elevator ride seemed to take an eternity. When the doors finally opened, Maria stepped out cautiously, her eyes darting left and right. She caught a glimpse of Antonio disappearing around a corner and followed at a safe distance. He stopped in front of a room and was quickly ushered inside. Maria crept closer, her heart pounding so loudly she was sure it would give her away. She pressed her ear to the door, straining to hear anything that might give her a clue as to what was happening. Inside, muffled voices drifted through the wood, too indistinct to make out clearly, but then a laugh, distinctly feminine adrenaline rang out. Maria felt as though she had been doused in ice water. Her suspicions about Antonio's infidelity, already strong, now seemed irrefutably confirmed. She was about to turn away, her mind reeling, when the door suddenly opened. Maria froze, finding herself face to face with a striking woman in her late 30s. Impeccably dressed and wearing an expression of surprise that quickly morphed into suspicion. "Can I help you?" the woman asked, her tone sharp. Before Maria could formulate a response, Antonio appeared behind the woman, his face drained of color as he recognized his wife. "Maria, what are you doing here?" The silence that followed was deafening. Maria's mind raced, searching for an explanation, an excuse, anything to salvage the situation. But as she looked between Antonio and the unknown woman, something clicked into place. This wasn't just about infidelity. The woman's professional demeanor, the stack of papers visible on a table inside the room, it all pointed to something more. Taking a deep breath, Maria straightened her spine and met Antonio's gaze directly. "I think we need to talk, Antonio. All of us." The next hour was a blur of revelations and confrontations. The woman, as it turned out, was not Antonio's mistress, but his lawyer, Victoria Tan. They had been meeting to discuss the very things Maria had been investigating: hidden accounts, questionable business dealings, and yes, the secret will that had started it all. Antonio, backed into a corner, attempted to explain. He spoke of protecting the family legacy, of securing their future against potential threats. But with each word, the depth of his deception became clearer. "How long have you been planning this?" Maria asked, her voice steady despite the turmoil inside her. "Since before our wedding." Antonio's silence was answer enough. Victoria, sensing the tension, attempted to mediate. "Mrs. Reyes, I understand this must be a shock, but I assure you, everything we've done is perfectly legal." Maria cut her off with a sharp laugh. "Legal, perhaps. Ethical, moral, I'm not so sure." She turned back to Antonio, her eyes blazing. "Did you ever intend to tell me any of this? Or was I just a convenient front for your schemes?" Antonio reached out to her, his face a mask of regret. "Maria, please, let me explain everything. This isn't what you think." But Maria had heard enough. She stood, gathering her belongings. "I think I've heard all I need to for now. We'll discuss this at home." Antonio, in private. As she walked out of the hotel room, her head held high despite the storm of emotions raging within her. Maria knew that everything had changed. The life she thought she had, the future she had imagined, it was all built on a foundation of lies. But as she made her way home, a strange calm settled over her. The shock and hurt were still there, but they were overshadowed by a growing sense of determination. She had uncovered the truth, or at least part of it. Now she had to decide what to do with that knowledge. The confrontation at home was inevitable and intense. Antonio arrived shortly after Maria, his usual composed demeanor shaken. He found her in the living room, a glass of wine in hand, her face a mask of calm that belied the turmoil within. "Maria, my love," he began, his voice placating. "I know what you must be thinking, but please, let me explain." Maria took a slow sip of her wine before responding. "Explain what, exactly? The secret meetings, the hidden accounts, or perhaps the will that leaves me with nothing? Where would you like to start, Antonio?" Her words, sharp and precise, cut through Antonio's attempted charm. He sank into a chair across from her, suddenly looking every bit his age. "It's not what you think," he said, running a hand through his hair. "Everything I've done for us, for our future." "Our future?" Maria echoed, her voice tinged with disbelief. "How does leaving me destitute in the event of your death secure our future?" Antonio leaned forward, his eyes pleading. "The will you found was just a draft, a precaution. I needed to ensure that my family's legacy was protected. Surely you can understand that." But Maria was not swayed. "What I understand is that you've been lying to me from the very beginning. Tell me, Antonio, was any of it real? Or was I just a convenient accessory to your grand plans?" The hurt in her voice seemed to pierce Antonio's defenses. He reached for her hand, but she pulled away. "Maria, please, I love you. That has always been real. Everything else, the accounts, the business dealings, the world of high finance is complex, dangerous even. I was trying to protect us both." Maria stood, pacing the room as she processed his words. Part of her wanted to believe him, to accept his explanations and return to the light. She had thought they were building together. But the rational part of her mind, the part that had been piecing together the clues for weeks, knew better. "If you truly wanted to protect us both," she said, turning to face him, "you would have been honest with me from the start. We're supposed to be partners, Antonio. How can I trust you now?" Antonio's shoulders sagged, the weight of his deceptions clearly taking their toll. "What can I do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How can I make this right?" Maria considered his question carefully. She knew that this moment, this conversation, would shape the course of their future. She could confront him with everything she had discovered, lay out all his lies and manipulations, but something held her back. A voice in the back of her mind whispered that knowledge was power, and she wasn't ready to show her full hand just yet. "I need time," she said finally. "Time to process all of this, to decide what it means for us. And I need complete transparency. From you, Antonio. No more secrets, no more hidden agendas. Can you give me that?" Antonio nodded eagerly, relief washing over his features. "Of course, my love. Anything you need. I'll open all the books to you, explain everything. Just don't give up on us, please." As Maria looked at her husband, she saw not the powerful, confident man she had married, but someone vulnerable, even desperate. It was a side of Antonio she had never seen before, and it gave her pause. Could there be more to his actions than simple greed or deception? "We'll see," she said, her tone non-committal. "For now, I think it's best if we sleep in separate rooms. I need space to think." Antonio looked as though he wanted to protest, but seemed to think better of it. He nodded, rising slowly from his chair. "I understand. Take all the time you need. I'll be here when you're ready to talk." Mom. As he left the room, shoulders slumped in defeat, Maria felt a complex mix of emotions wash over her. Anger, hurt, and betrayal were still there, burning just beneath the surface. But there was something else too, a sense of clarity and purpose that she had never experienced before. She knew that the coming days and weeks would be challenging. There were still many questions to be answered, many truths to be uncovered. But as she stood there in the quiet of their grand living room, Maria felt a shift within herself. She was no longer just Antonio Reyes's wife, a decorative accessory to his world of wealth and power. She was a woman coming into her own strength, ready to fight for what was rightfully hers. With a deep breath, Maria finished her wine and made her way to the guest bedroom. As she prepared for bed, her mind was already formulating plans. She would use this time of processing to dig deeper, to uncover every last secret Antonio had kept from her. And when she had all the pieces of the puzzle, she would decide her next move. The game had changed, but Maria was more than ready to play. As she drifted off to sleep, a small, determined smile played across her lips. Antonio had no idea what he had unleashed, but he would soon find out. The woman he had underestimated, the bride he thought he could control, was about to show him just how formidable she could be. The following weeks were a delicate dance of investigation and deception. Maria maintained a facade of a wife struggling to come to terms with her husband's actions, while secretly delving deeper into Antonio's affairs. She used the promise of reconciliation as leverage, convincing Antonio to grant her access to financial records and business documents she had previously been denied. Every night, after Antonio had retired to his separate bedroom, Maria would pore over the information she had gathered. She created spreadsheets, mapping out the complex web of Antonio's business dealings. Slowly but surely, a clearer picture began to emerge. She discovered that Antonio's empire was built on a foundation far shakier than she had initially believed. While many of his businesses were legitimate and thriving, there were others that existed in a gray area of legality. Offshore accounts, shell companies, and questionable partnerships painted a picture of a man willing to skirt the edges of the law to maintain his wealth and status. But it was the personal betrayals that cut the deepest. Maria uncovered evidence of not one, but several affairs over the years. She found records of expensive gifts, hotel reservations, and clandestine meetings that left little doubt about Antonio's infidelity. As the extent of Antonio's deceptions became clear, Maria's resolve strengthened. She knew that confronting him directly would only lead to more lies. Instead, she began to formulate a plan, one that would not only secure her future, but also ensure that Antonio faced consequences for his actions. One particularly illuminating discovery came in the form of a series of emails between Antonio and his longtime friend and business partner, Senator Ramon Villar. The correspondence correspondence hinted at a scheme to manipulate government contracts, using insider information to secure lucrative deals for Antonio's companies. Maria realized that this information could be explosive if revealed to the right people, but she also knew that she needed to tread carefully. The world she was navigating was dangerous, filled with powerful people who would stop at nothing to protect their interests. As she dug deeper, Maria began to reach out to trusted contacts of her own. She reconnected with an old friend from university who now worked as a financial analyst, seeking advice on how to protect her own interests. Under the guise of taking a more active role in Antonio's charitable foundation, she made connections with influential women in Manila's social circles, quietly building a network of potential allies. Throughout it all, Maria maintained her role as the dutiful, if somewhat distant, wife. She attended social functions on Antonio's arm, played hostess at dinner parties, and continued to present a united front to the outside world. But behind closed doors, the distance between them grew. Antonio, for his part, seemed torn between guilt and frustration. He made attempts at reconciliation, bringing her gifts and planning romantic gestures, but each time, Maria gently rebuffed him, insisting that she needed more time, more transparency, more proof of his commitment to change. It was during one of these attempts at reconciliation that Maria saw an opportunity to push for more information. Antonio had arranged a private dinner for them on the terrace of their home, complete with candlelight and her favorite dishes. As they sat across from each other, the city lights twinkling in the distance, Antonio reached for her hand. "Maria, my love," he began, his voice soft and pleading. "I know I've made mistakes, terrible mistakes, but I want you to know that everything I've done with our future in mind. Please tell me what I can do to make things right between us." Maria looked at him, studying the face of the man she had once thought she knew so well. She saw the lines of stress around his eyes, the gray at his temples that seemed more pronounced than ever. For a moment, she felt a flicker of the love she had once felt for him, but it was quickly overshadowed by the memory of his betrayals. Taking a deep breath, she decided to take a risk. "Antonio," she said, her voice steady, "I appreciate your efforts, I do. But if we're going to move forward, I need to understand everything. Not just the broad strokes, but the details. I need to know about the offshore accounts, the deals with Senator Villar, all of it." Antonio's face paled, his hand tightening around hers. "How did you—" "Maria, those things are complicated. It's not as simple as—" She cut him off, her gaze unwavering. "I'm not a child, Antonio. I'm your wife, your partner. If you truly want to make things right, you'll tell me everything. No more secrets, no more half-truths." For a long moment, Antonio was silent, conflict clear in his eyes. Then, with a heavy sigh, he began to talk. Over the next few hours, he laid bare the intricacies of his business empire, the deals made in the shadows, the lines crossed in the pursuit of wealth and power. As Maria listened, she felt a mix of emotions. Part of her was horrified at the extent of Antonio's misdeeds, but another part, a part that surprised her, felt a thrill of excitement. With each revelation, she saw not just the depth of his betrayal, but also opportunities, leverage she could use to secure her own position. By the time Antonio finished talking, the candles had burned low, and a new day was dawning. He looked at her, exhaustion and fear evident in his eyes. "So, now you know everything," he said, his voice hoarse. "What happens now, Maria?" Maria stood, walking to the edge of the terrace. As she looked out over the city, she felt a sense of clarity she hadn't experienced in weeks. She turned back to Antonio, her decision made. "Now," she said, her voice calm and determined, "we move forward, together for now, but on my terms." Antonio nodded, relief washing over his features. He didn't realize that the woman standing before him was not the same one he had married. He didn't understand that in trying to protect his empire, he had created something far more dangerous, a woman with nothing left to lose and everything to gain. As Maria went to bed that morning, her mind was already racing with plans. She had the information she needed, the pieces of the puzzle finally falling into place. Now, it was time to put that knowledge to use. But Maria was no longer just a player. She was poised to become the master. In the days following Antonio's confession, Maria's mind was a whirlwind of activity. She knew that the information she now possessed was both powerful and dangerous. It was time to transform from a victim of circumstance into the architect of her own destiny. Her first step was to secure her position. Using the knowledge Antonio had shared, Maria began to subtly insert herself into his business affairs. She requested to attend meetings, asked pointed questions about financial reports, and made it clear that she was no longer content to be a silent partner in their marriage. Antonio, still desperate to make amends, acquiesced to her requests. He seemed relieved, even proud, to see Maria taking an interest in his world. Little did he know that with each meeting, each document she reviewed, Maria was building her own understanding of the complex web of businesses and relationships that formed the foundation of his empire. As she delved deeper into Antonio's affairs, Maria realized that she needed more than just knowledge. She needed allies. Her thoughts turned to Elena, the housekeeper who had been with the family for years. Elena had always been kind to Maria, and she suspected that the older woman knew more about the household secrets than she let on. One afternoon, while Antonio was out, Maria invited Elena to join her for tea. As they sat in the sunlit conservatory, Maria carefully steered the conversation towards the household staff's opinions of Antonio. "Elena," Maria began, her voice gentle but probing, "you've been with the family for so long. You must have seen a lot over the years." Elena's eyes, wise and watchful, studied Maria's face. "Yes, Mrs. Reyes, I have seen many things." Maria leaned in, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "And what do you think of Mr. Reyes, of the way he conducts his business?" For a moment, Elena hesitated, years of discretion warring with what seemed to be a deep-seated need to unburden herself. Finally, she spoke, her words careful but revealing. "Mr. Reyes is a powerful man, Mrs. Reyes, and powerful men often believe they can do as they please." It was all the opening Maria needed. Over the next hour, she gently coaxed information from Elena, piecing together years of overheard conversations, late-night meetings, and suspicious visitors. By the time they finished their tea, Maria had gained not just information, but a valuable ally in Elena. With Elena's insights adding to her growing pool of knowledge, Maria turned her attention to the wider world of Manila's elite. She began to attend more social functions, no longer content to be merely Antonio's arm candy. Instead, she engaged in conversations, paid attention to the subtle power dynamics at play, and started to form her own network of connections. It was at one of these events, a charity gala for a local children's hospital, that Maria met Isabella Torres, the wife of a prominent judge. As they chatted over champagne, Maria sensed a kindred spirit in Isabella, a woman who, like her, had married into power but yearned for more. "It's not easy, is it?" Isabella mused, her eyes scanning the room filled with Manila's most influential figures. Being the wife of a powerful man, always in the background, never quite in control of your own destiny. Maria nodded, seeing an opportunity. "It doesn't have to be that way, though, does it? We're more than just wives and hostesses. We have our own strengths, our own ambitions." Isabella's eyes lit up with interest. "You sound like a woman with a plan, Maria. I like that." From that moment, a friendship was born. Over the following weeks, Maria and Isabella met regularly, their conversations ranging from social gossip to more serious discussions about the realities of life in Manila's upper echelons. Maria was careful never to reveal too much about her own situation, but she listened intently to Isabella's stories, filing away every piece of information that might prove useful. As her network grew and her understanding of Antonio's world deepened, Maria began to formulate a plan. She knew that simply confronting Antonio with evidence of his misdeeds wouldn't be enough. He was too powerful, too well-connected. No, if she wanted to secure her future and ensure that Antonio faced consequences for his actions, she would need to be more strategic. Her opportunity came sooner than expected. One evening, as she was reviewing some of Antonio's business documents, she stumbled upon a series of emails that made her blood run cold. They detailed a plan to bribe several government officials in order to secure a lucrative infrastructure contract. The potential profits were enormous, but so were the risks. Maria knew she had stumbled upon something big. This wasn't just another shady deal. This was the kind of scandal that could bring down empires. Her first instinct was to confront, but she forced herself to stay calm. This information was too valuable to waste on an emotional confrontation. Instead, she carefully copied the emails funds, storing them securely in a cloud account Antonio knew nothing about. Then she began to plot her next move. Over the next few days, Maria watched Antonio closely. She noticed the tension in his shoulders, the worried frown that creased his brow when he thought no one was looking. The pressure of his illicit dealings was clearly taking its toll. It was time to make her move. One evening, as they sat down to dinner, Maria casually brought up the infrastructure project. "I was looking over some of the company reports," she said, keeping her tone light and interested. "That new project looks like it could be quite profitable. How are things progressing with the government approvals?" Antonio nearly choked on his wine. "What? Oh, yes, the project. It's coming along. These things take time, you know. Lots of red tape to navigate." Maria nodded sympathetically. "Of course. It must be so stressful dealing with all those officials. I imagine it would be tempting to try and speed things along." The color drained from Antonio's face. "What exactly are you implying, Maria?" She met his gaze steadily. "I'm not implying anything, Antonio. I'm telling you that I know about the bribes, about all of it, and we need to talk about what happens next." For a moment, Antonio looked like he might deny everything, but then his shoulders sagged, and he seemed to age years in an instant. "How did you find out?" "That's not important," Maria replied. "What matters is what we're going to do about it. This isn't just another deal, Antonio. This could ruin everything we've built." Antonio's eyes narrowed. "We? Since when have you been so concerned about the business, Maria? I thought you were content to let me handle these matters." Maria leaned forward, her voice low and intense. "Things change, Antonio. I've changed, and it's time for you to realize that we're in this together now, for better or worse. So we need to figure out how to fix this before it's too late." For hours, they talked, argued, and strategized. Maria carefully played the role of the concerned wife, offering support while subtly steering the conversation in the direction she wanted. By the end of the night, she had convinced Antonio to back out of the bribery scheme, even if it meant losing the contract. As she went to bed that night, Maria felt a mix of triumph and trepidation. She had successfully navigated her first major crisis, proving to herself that she could hold her own in Antonio's world. But she also knew that this was just the beginning. There would be more challenges ahead, more secrets to uncover, more battles to fight. In the weeks that followed, Maria continued to expand her influence. She took a more active role in Antonio's businesses, attending meetings and offering input on key decisions. To her surprise, she found that she had a talent for strategy and negotiation. The skills she had honed in navigating Manila's social scene translated well to the boardroom. Antonio, for his part, seemed both impressed and unsettled by Maria's newfound assertiveness. He clearly appreciated having her support and insights, but there were moments when she caught him watching her with a wary expression, as if he was only now realizing the full extent of her capabilities. As Maria's confidence grew, so did her ambitions. She began to see opportunities not just to protect herself, but to build something of her own. She started to explore the possibility of launching a charitable foundation, one that would focus on education and empowerment for young women from disadvantaged backgrounds. The idea of the foundation served multiple purposes. It would give Maria a platform of her own, separate from Antonio's businesses. It would help to solidify her image as a philanthropist and community leader. And perhaps most importantly, it would provide a legitimate reason for her to network with other powerful women and to travel independently. As she worked on the plans for her foundation, Maria continued to gather information. She cultivated relationships with key figures in Antonio's world, always listening, always observing. She became adept at piecing together fragments of conversation, at reading between the lines of financial reports and legal documents. One of her most valuable sources of information turned out to be Antonio himself. As their relationship stabilized and he grew more comfortable with her involvement in his affairs, he began to confide in her more freely. Late at night, over glasses of whiskey, he would talk about his frustrations, his fears, and his plans for the future. Maria listened to it all, offering comfort and advice when needed, but always filing away the important details. She knew that knowledge was power, and she was determined to amass as much of both as she could. Maria's transformation revelation became impossible to ignore. Gone was the naive bride who had walked down the aisle at the Manila Cathedral. In her place stood a woman of substance and ambition, respected in her own right and no longer, and content to live in her husband's shadow. But even as she reveled in her newfound power and purpose, Maria never forgot the betrayals that had set her on this path. The secret will, the hidden accounts, the affairs, all were etched indelibly in her memory. She knew that one day there would be a reckoning, and when that day came, she would be ready. As she stood on the balcony of their mansion one evening, looking out over the glittering lights of Manila, Maria allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. She had come so far, learned so much, but she knew that her journey was far from over. The game was still being played, the stakes higher than ever, and Maria was determined to win. As Maria's influence grew, so did the whispers in Manila's elite circles. The transformation of Antonio Reyes' young wife from a quiet, ornamental presence to a force to be reckoned with had not gone unnoticed. Some admired her newfound confidence and business acumen, while others viewed her ascent with suspicion and resentment. One balmy evening, at a gala for the city's most influential figures, Maria found herself the center of attention. She moved through the crowd with grace and purpose, engaging in conversations about politics, business, and philanthropy with equal ease. Her champagne flute remained mostly untouched as she focused on the real purpose of the evening, gathering information and solidifying alliances. As she chatted with the wife of a prominent senator, Maria caught sight of Antonio across the room. He was deep in conversation with several men she recognized as key players in the construction industry. The tightness around his eyes and the forced nature of his smile told her that the discussion was not going well. Excusing herself politely, Maria made her way to Antonio's side. As she approached, she caught the tail end of the conversation. "I'm sorry, Antonio, but the deal is off," one of the men was saying, his tone firm but regretful. "The risks are simply too high given the current political climate." Antonio's face flushed with anger, but before he could respond, Maria smoothly interjected, "Gentlemen, I couldn't help but overhear. Perhaps we could discuss this further over dinner next week. I'm sure if we put our heads together, we can find a solution that benefits everyone." The men exchanged glances, clearly surprised by her intervention, but Maria's charm and confidence were hard to resist. Within minutes, she had secured a dinner meeting and smoothed over the tension. As the men moved away, Antonio turned to Maria, a mix of gratitude and wariness in his eyes. "Thank you," he said quietly, "but I hope you know what you're doing. This situation is more complicated than it seems." Maria met his gaze steadily. "I'm well aware of the complications, Antonio. Trust me, I can handle it." As they made their way home that night, Maria's mind was racing. She knew that the failed deal Antonio had been discussing was crucial to their financial stability. The infrastructure project it was tied to represented a significant portion of their projected income for the next 5 years. If it fell through, the repercussions could be severe. But where Antonio saw a crisis, Maria saw an opportunity. Over the next few days, she threw herself into research, poring over financial reports, legal documents, and industry analyses. She called in favors from contacts she had cultivated over the past months, seeking insider information and expert opinions. By the time the dinner meeting arrived, Maria had formulated a plan. As they sat around the elegant dining table in one of Manila's most exclusive restaurants, she listened carefully as Antonio and the other businessmen rehashed their concerns about the project. When there was a lull in the conversation, Maria spoke up. "Gentlemen, I believe I have a proposition that might address everyone's concerns." All eyes turned to her, some curious, others skeptical. Undeterred, Maria laid out her plan. She proposed restructuring the deal to spread the risk more evenly among the involved parties. Additionally, she suggested bringing in a reputable international firm as a partner, which would not only provide additional expertise but also lend credibility to the project in the eyes of government regulators. As she spoke, Maria could see the men's expressions changing from doubt to interest. She had done her homework, anticipating their objections and addressing them before they could be raised. By the end of the evening, the mood had shifted dramatically. What had begun as a somber gathering to officially end a business relationship had transformed into an excited discussion of new possibilities. As they left the restaurant, Antonio, "That was incredible," he said, his voice a mix of admiration and bewilderment. "Where did you learn to negotiate like that?" Maria smiled smiled, a hint of steel beneath the sweetness. "I've always had it in me, Antonio. I just needed the right motivation to bring it out." In the weeks that followed, Maria's star continued to rise. The restructured deal went through, earning her the respect and gratitude of not just Antonio, but also his business associates. Her reputation as a shrewd negotiator and problem solver began to spread through Manila's business community. But even as she basked in her success, Maria never lost sight of her ultimate goal. Every move she made, every relationship she cultivated, was carefully calculated to strengthen her position and gather more information about Antonio's dealings. Her chance to put all her gathered knowledge to use came sooner than she expected. One evening, as she was working late in the home office, she received an urgent call from Isabella Torres, her friend and confidant. "Maria, you need to be careful." Isabella's voice was low and urgent. "I've heard rumors. Some people are asking questions about Antonio's past deals, particularly the ones involving government contracts." Maria's heart raced, but she kept her voice calm. "Thank you for letting me know, Isabella. Can you tell me more?" As Isabella shared what she knew, Maria's mind was already formulating a plan. She had been preparing for this moment, gathering evidence and building alliances. Now it was time to act. Over the next few days, Maria moved with calculated precision. She reached out to her network of contacts, subtly gathering more information about the investigation. At the same time, she began to distance herself from Antonio's more questionable business dealings, ensuring that she had plausible deniability if things went south. She also took steps to secure her own financial future. Using the knowledge she had gained over the past months, she made a series of shrewd investments, moving assets into accounts that Antonio couldn't access. As the pressure mounted, Antonio began to unravel. Maria watched as he became increasingly paranoid and short-tempered, snapping at staff and drinking more heavily than usual. She knew it was only a matter of time before he made a mistake. That mistake came on a rainy Tuesday afternoon. Maria returned home early from a meeting to find Antonio in his study, hurriedly shredding documents. The panic in his eyes when he saw her told her everything she needed to know. "Antonio," she said softly, her voice laden with disappointment. "What have you done?" For a moment he looked like he might try to lie, but then, perhaps seeing the knowledge in her eyes, he slumped in defeat. "It's all falling apart, Maria," he said, his voice breaking. "They're going to find out everything." Maria moved to his side, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Tell me everything, Antonio. Maybe I can help." And so, over the next few hours, Antonio confessed. He told her about the bribes, the falsified records, the offshore accounts where he had hidden millions of pesos. As he spoke, Maria listened carefully, her face a mask of concern and support. But inside, she was cataloging every detail, fitting them into the puzzle she had been assembling for months. When Antonio finally fell silent, exhausted by his confession, Maria knew it was time to make her move. "Antonio," she said gently, "I think I know how we can fix this, but you're going to have to trust me completely. Can you do that?" Antonio looked up at her, hope flickering in his eyes. "Of course, my love. What do you have in mind?" Maria outlined her plan. They would get ahead of the investigation by coming forward voluntarily. Antonio would admit to some minor indiscretions, enough to satisfy the authorities, but not enough to lead to serious charges. Meanwhile, Maria would use her connections and the goodwill she had built up to manage the public relations fallout. What Maria didn't tell Antonio was that she had no intention of stopping there. As soon as he agreed to her plan, she set in motion a series of carefully orchestrated moves that would not only protect her from the fallout of Antonio's crimes, but would also position her to take control of his empire. Over the next few weeks, as the investigation unfolded, Maria played her role to perfection. To the outside world, she was the loyal, supportive wife, standing by her husband as he cooperated with the authorities. But behind the scenes, she was methodically dismantling the very foundations of Antonio's power. She reached out to key investors, assuring them that she had the situation under control. She negotiated with creditors, using her charm and business acumen to buy time and favorable terms. And all the while, she was carefully documenting everything, building an ironclad case that would ensure her control over the Reyes fortune. The final day of Antonio's hearing, as they prepared to leave for the courthouse, Maria handed him a stack of papers. "What's this?" he asked, flipping through the documents with a frown. It's a new will, Maria replied calmly, and some other legal documents. Given the circumstances, I thought it would be wise to update everything, to protect our assets, you understand. Antonio nodded distractedly, his mind clearly on the upcoming hearing. Without really looking at the papers, he signed where Maria indicated. It wasn't until much later that he would realize the full implications of what he had done. As they stood on the steps of the courthouse, cameras flashing around them, Maria squeezed Antonio's hand reassuringly. To the world, they presented a united front, but Maria knew that this was the beginning of the end for Antonio Reyes, and for her, it was just the beginning of a new chapter. In the months that followed, Maria's plan unfolded with precision. Antonio, facing the consequences of his actions, became increasingly dependent on her. She managed the legal proceedings, the business affairs, and the public relations with a skill that left even their harshest critics impressed. Slowly but surely, control of the Reyes empire shifted from Antonio to Maria. By the time the dust settled, she had secured her position as the de facto head of their business interests. Antonio, his reputation in tatters and his confidence shaken, found himself relegated to a figurehead role. As Maria sat in what had once been Antonio's office, looking out over the Manila skyline, she allowed herself a moment of reflection. The journey had been long and difficult, filled with challenges she could never have imagined when she first walked down the aisle. But she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more powerful than ever. She thought back to the naive bride she had once been, the woman who had discovered that secret will and felt her world crumbling around her. That woman was gone, replaced by someone who understood the true nature of power and wasn't afraid to wield it. A knock on the door interrupted her thoughts. It was her assistant reminding her of a board meeting scheduled for the afternoon. Maria nodded, gathering her papers and straightening her suit. As she walked out of the office, her heels clicking confidently on the polished floor, she couldn't help but smile. The game wasn't over, not by a long shot, but Maria Reyes was no longer just a player. She was the one making the rules, and she was just getting started. The boardroom of Reyes Enterprises buzzed with nervous energy as executives and board members filed in, their hushed conversations filling the air with tension. At the head of the long mahogany table, Maria Reyes sat perfectly poised, her expression unreadable as she watched the room fill. Gone was the hesitant newlywed of a year ago. In her place sat a woman who exuded confidence and authority. As the last member took their seat, Maria cleared her throat, instantly commanding the attention of everyone present. "Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice clear and steady. "I know there have been many rumors and speculations about the future of our company. Today, we're here to address those concerns and chart a new course for Reyes Enterprises." She paused, letting her gaze sweep across the room, meeting the eyes of each person present. Some looked back with curiosity, others with thinly veiled skepticism. Maria knew that many of them still saw her as Antonio's trophy wife, thrust into a position of power she wasn't qualified to hold. She was about to prove them all wrong. "As you're all aware, my husband Antonio is currently unable to fulfill his duties as CEO due to ongoing legal matters," she continued, her tone matter-of-fact. "In light of this, the board has appointed me as interim CEO. I intend to use this opportunity to implement some much-needed changes in our organization." A murmur rippled through the room at her words. Maria could see the surprise and disbelief on some faces, but she pressed on, undeterred. "Our first order of business is to address the ethical concerns that have been raised about some of our past dealings. I've initiated a full internal audit of all our operations, and I expect complete cooperation from every department." She turned to the CFO, a man who had worked closely with Antonio for years. "Mr. Santos, I'll need a comprehensive report on all our financial transactions for the past 5 years. Every contract, every investment, every offshore account. Nothing is to be omitted." Santos paled visibly, his discomfort evident. "Mrs. Reyes, surely you understand that some of our financial arrangements are complex. It might take some time to compile all that information." Maria's smile was polite but unyielding. "I understand completely, Mr. Santos. That's why I've already engaged an independent auditing firm to assist you." The CFO's mouth opened and closed soundlessly, but but Maria had already moved on. Next, I want to discuss our upcoming infrastructure project in Mindanao. There have been concerns raised about the environmental impact and the displacement of local communities. I propose we halt all work until we can conduct a thorough reassessment. This announcement was met with outright objections from several board members. The project was worth millions, they argued. Delays would be costly. Investors would be furious. Maria listened to their protests calmly, waiting for the clamor to die down before she spoke again. I understand your concerns, she said, her voice cutting through the noise, but I also understand the importance of corporate responsibility. We have an opportunity here to set a new standard for ethical business practices in the Philippines. Yes, it may cost us in the short term, but in the long run, it will cement our reputation as a company that values more than just profit. For the next 2 hours, Maria laid out her vision for the future of Reyes Enterprises. She proposed new transparency measures, stricter ethical guidelines, and a shift towards more sustainable business practices. With each point, she demonstrated a deep understanding of the company's operations and the challenges they faced. By the end of the meeting, even her harshest critics seemed grudgingly impressed. As the board members filed out, Maria overheard snippets of their conversations. She certainly knows her stuff, one muttered. Antonio's been grooming her for this all along, another speculated. Maria allowed herself a small smile as she gathered her papers. Let them think Antonio had prepared her for this role. The truth that she had educated herself, navigated the complex world of corporate politics, and outmaneuvered her own husband was far more satisfying. As she left the boardroom, her assistant fell into step beside her. Mrs. Reyes, your husband is waiting in your office. He says it's urgent. Maria nodded, her face betraying no emotion. Thank you, Clara. I'll see him now. She found Antonio pacing in her office, his once immaculate appearance now showing signs of strain. His hair was disheveled, his shirt wrinkled, and there were dark circles under his eyes. When he saw Maria, he stopped abruptly. What's this? I hear about halting the Mindanao project, he demanded without preamble. Do you have any idea how much money we stand to lose? Maria calmly took a seat behind her desk, gesturing for Antonio to sit as well. He remained standing, his agitation palpable. I'm well aware of the financial implications, Antonio, she replied evenly. But I'm also aware of the legal and reputational risks if we proceed without addressing the concerns that have been raised. Antonio ran a hand through his hair in frustration. We can't afford to be so cautious right now, Maria. With the investigation ongoing, we need every bit of profit we can generate. And that's precisely why we need to be above reproach in all our dealings moving forward, Maria countered. Trust me, Antonio. I have a plan. For a moment, Antonio looked like he wanted to argue further, but then, as if all the fight had suddenly gone out of him, he slumped into a chair. I suppose I have no choice but to trust you, he said, his voice tinged with bitterness. After all, you're the one in charge now, aren't you? Maria regarded her husband carefully. She saw in him now a shadow of the powerful man she had married, brought low by his own hubris and mistakes. Part of her felt a twinge of sympathy, but she quickly suppressed it. She couldn't afford sentiment, not when there was still so much at stake. We're in this together, Antonio, she said, her tone softening slightly. Everything I'm doing is to secure our future, to protect what we've built. Antonio looked up at her, a flicker of the old sharpness in his eyes. Is it, Maria? Sometimes I wonder if you're protecting our future or just your own. Maria met his gaze unflinchingly. In this case, Antonio, they're one and the same. As Antonio left her office, Maria turned to look out the window at the Manila skyline. The city stretched out before her, a landscape of opportunity and challenge. She had come so far, but she knew the real test was still to come. Over the next few weeks, Maria's new policies sent shockwaves through the business community. The announcement of the Mindanao project suspension made headlines, drawing both criticism and praise. Environmental groups hailed it as a step in the right direction, while industry insiders whispered that Reyes Enterprises was on the brink of collapse. Maria weathered the storm with unwavering determination. She gave interviews, met with investors, and worked tirelessly to implement her vision for the company. Slowly but surely, the tide of public opinion began to turn. It was during this tumultuous period that Maria received an unexpected visit when her assistant announced that Isabella Torres was there to see her. Maria's friend entered entered the office, her face grave. "Maria, I hope I'm not interrupting, but I had to speak with you in person." "Of course not." "Isabella." "What's wrong?" Maria asked, noting the worry in her friend's eyes. Isabella took a seat, her usually impeccable composure showing signs of strain. "It's about Antonio," she said quietly. "I've heard some disturbing rumors. There are whispers that he's been meeting with some unsavory characters. People are saying he might be planning something desperate." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. She had been so focused on steering the company through its current crisis that she had perhaps underestimated Antonio's potential for retaliation. "What kind of desperate, Isabella?" she asked, keeping her voice calm despite the sudden racing of her heart. Isabella leaned forward, lowering her voice further. "The kind that could undo everything you've worked for, Maria. I don't have any concrete evidence, but my sources are reliable. You need to be careful." Maria nodded, her mind already racing with possibilities. "Thank you for telling me, Isabella. I'll take precautions." After Isabella left, Maria sat in her office for a long time, contemplating her next move. She had always known that Antonio might not accept his reduced role gracefully, but she had hoped that self-preservation would keep him in check. Now, it seemed she would have to take more drastic measures to protect herself and the company. The next morning, Maria called an emergency meeting with her most trusted advisors. As they gathered in her office, she laid out the situation. "We have reason to believe that Antonio may be planning some sort of action against the company," she began, her tone serious. "I need options." For the next few hours, they brainstormed strategies, legal maneuvers, security measures, PR contingencies. All were discussed and debated. By the end of the meeting, Maria had a plan. Her first step was to tighten security around all of the company's assets and information. She implemented new protocols for accessing sensitive data and increased physical security at all Reyes Enterprises properties. Next, she reached out to her network of allies in the business and political world. Without revealing too much, she put them on alert, asking them to keep an ear out for any unusual activity related to Antonio or the company. Finally, and perhaps most painfully, she decided it was time to distance herself personally from Antonio. They had been maintaining the appearance of a united front for the sake of the company, but Maria knew that this facade could no longer continue. That evening, she returned home earlier than usual. She found Antonio in his study, a glass of whiskey in hand, staring out the window. When he saw her, a bitter smile crossed his face. "To what do I owe the pleasure of my wife's company?" he asked, his words slightly slurred. "Have you come to issue more orders, or perhaps to remind me of my place?" Maria steeled herself for what she knew would be a difficult conversation. "Antonio, we need to talk about our living arrangements." He turned to face her fully, his eyes narrowing. "What about them?" "I think it would be best if we separated," Maria said, her voice calm but firm. "For both our sakes and for the sake of the company. The current situation isn't sustainable." For a long moment, Antonio said nothing. Then, with a suddenness that startled Maria, he hurled his glass against the wall. It shattered, sending shards of crystal and droplets of whiskey flying. "The company," he spat, his face contorted with rage. "It's always about the company with you now, isn't it? Well, let me tell you something, Maria. That company was built by me. It's mine, and I'll be damned if I let you take it from me." Maria stood her ground, refusing to be intimidated. "The company belongs to both of us, Antonio, and right now, I'm the one keeping it afloat. If you have a problem with how I'm running things, take it up with the board." Antonio advanced on her, his eyes blazing with a mixture of anger and something else, something that looked almost like fear. "You think you've won, don't you? You think you've got it all figured out, but you have no idea what I'm capable of." Maria, no idea at all. For a split second, Maria felt a flicker of the old fear she had experienced when she first discovered Antonio's deceptions, but she quickly pushed it aside. She was not that woman anymore. "I know exactly what you're capable of, Antonio," she said, her voice low and intense. "That's why I'm doing what needs to be done. For both our sakes, don't make this any harder than it has to be." With that, she turned and left the room, her heart pounding but her resolve stronger than ever. As she climbed the stairs to pack her things, she knew that a line had been crossed. The game had entered a new... In the days that followed, Maria threw herself into her work with renewed vigor. She moved into a penthouse apartment in the city, city, citing the need to be closer to the office. In reality, she wanted to put physical distance between herself and Antonio to give herself space to think and plan. The separation made headlines, of course. Maria's PR team worked overtime to spin it as an amicable decision, a mutual choice to focus on their individual roles within the company. But in the privacy of her new home, Maria allowed herself to acknowledge the truth. She was at war with her husband, and only one of them would emerge victorious. As she sat on her balcony one evening, looking out over the city she had come to, sea as her domain, Maria reflected on how far she had come. From a naive bride to a powerful CEO, she had transformed herself through sheer determination and cunning. But she knew that the greatest challenge still lay ahead. Antonio's threat lingered in her mind, a constant reminder of the danger she faced. She had no doubt that he was plotting something, gathering his own allies and resources for a counterattack. The question was, what form would that attack take? Maria sipped her wine, her mind racing with possibilities and contingencies. She had come too far to lose everything now. Whatever Antonio had planned, she would be ready, and when the dust settled, she would be the one left standing, in control of the empire she had fought so hard to claim. As the lights of Manila twinkled below her, Maria allowed herself a small smile. The game was far from over, but she had never felt more prepared to play. Let Antonio make his move, she thought. She would be waiting, ready to turn his own strategies against him and emerge stronger than ever. With renewed determination, Maria turned back to her laptop, where financial reports and strategy documents awaited her attention. There was work to be done, an empire to secure and a future to safeguard. And Maria Reyes was more than ready for the challenge. The morning sun had barely risen over Manila's skyline when Maria's phone buzzed with an urgent message. It was from her head of security, a former military officer she had hired to bolster the company's defenses. Unusual activity detected at the main server room last night. Footage shows an unauthorized access attempt. You need to see this. Maria's heart raced as she quickly dressed and headed to the office. As she navigated through the early morning traffic, her mind whirled with possibilities. Was this Antonio's first move, or was it something else entirely? At Reyes Enterprises headquarters, Maria found her security team huddled around a bank of monitors. They straightened as she entered, their faces grim. "Show me," she commanded, her voice steady despite the anxiety churning in her stomach. The head of security, a man named Ramirez, pulled up the footage. On the screen, a figure in dark clothing could be seen attempting to bypass the security protocols on the server room door. The face was obscured, but there was something familiar about the way the person moved. "We've enhanced the image as much as possible," Ramirez explained, "but we can't get a clear view of the face. However, the access codes they were trying to use were old ones, codes that were changed when you took over as CEO." Maria's eyes narrowed. Codes that Antonio would have known. Ramirez nodded. "That's our thinking as well. Fortunately, our new security measures held. They weren't able to gain access." Maria stood in silence for a moment, processing this information. If it was indeed Antonio behind this attempt, it meant he was getting desperate, and a desperate Antonio was a dangerous Antonio. "I want a full security audit," she said finally. "Every system, every access point, and I want guards posted at all sensitive areas 24/7. No one gets in without my express permission, understood?" As her team scrambled to comply with her orders, Maria retreated to her office. She needed time to think, to plan her next move. She had anticipated that Antonio might try something, but she hadn't expected him to be so bold so soon. Just as she was about to close her office door, her assistant Clara appeared, looking flustered. "Mrs. Reyes, I'm sorry to bother you, but there's a situation developing. The press is reporting that several major investors are pulling out of Reyes Enterprises. Our stock price is starting to drop." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. This couldn't be a coincidence. "Get me our PR team and our chief financial officer," she ordered. "Now!" As she waited for her team to assemble, Maria pulled up the financial news on her computer. The reports were alarming. Several key investors, longtime supporters of Reyes Enterprises, had abruptly announced their intention to divest. The market was reacting with predictable panic. When her CFO, Mr. Santos, entered the office, his face was ashen. "Mrs. Reyes, these investors, they were solid. I spoke with most of them just last week, and they were fully on board with our new direction." Maria's mind was racing. "This isn't about our performance or our strategy. strategy, she said slowly. This is Antonio. He must have gotten to them somehow. The realization hit her like a physical blow. While she had been focused on protecting the company's assets and information, Antonio had been working on a different angle altogether. He was attacking their financial foundation, using his old connections to undermine investor confidence. For the next several hours, Maria and her team worked tirelessly to contain the damage. They issued statements, made calls to key stakeholders, and strategized ways to shore up their position. But as the day wore on, it became clear that they were fighting an uphill battle. By the time the markets closed, Reyes Enterprises' stock had dropped by 15%. It wasn't a fatal blow, but it was a serious setback, and Maria knew that this was likely just the opening salvo in Antonio's campaign against her. As she dismissed her exhausted team for the night, promising them that they would regroup in the morning, Maria felt a mix of anger and grudging admiration. Antonio had played this move well. He had struck at the company's reputation, its perceived stability, in a way that she couldn't easily counter. Alone in her office, Maria poured herself a glass of whiskey, a habit she had picked up from Antonio during their marriage. As she sipped the amber liquid, she stared out at the Manila skyline, its lights twinkling in the darkness. She had underestimated. Antonio allowed herself to believe that his reduced role in the company had neutralized him as a threat. It was a mistake she wouldn't make again. A soft knock on her door interrupted her thoughts. It was Elena, the housekeeper, who had become one of her most trusted confidants. "Mrs. Reyes, I heard about what happened today. I thought you might need this." Elena placed a small manila envelope on Maria's desk. It was hidden in Mr. Reyes's old study, behind a loose panel. "I found it while cleaning last week." Maria's heart quickened as she opened the envelope. Inside were photographs and documents, evidence of Antonio's past indiscretions and shady dealings. It was a goldmine of information, the kind of leverage that could turn the tide in her favor. As she looked through the contents, a plan began to form in Maria's mind. Antonio had shown his hand, revealed the depths to which he was willing to go to reclaim control of the company. Now it was her turn to counter, to show him that she was more than capable of playing this game at his level. "Thank you, Eleanor," Maria said, her voice filled with newfound determination. "You have no idea how important this is." As Elena left, closing the door softly behind her, Maria turned back to the city view. The lights seemed brighter now, full of possibility. Antonio had landed a blow today, but the fight was far from over, and Maria Reyes was just getting started. The next morning, Maria arrived at the office early, her mind clear and focused despite the lack of sleep. She had spent most of the night formulating her strategy, and now it was time to put it into action. Her first move was to call an emergency board meeting. As the members filed in, their faces etched with worry and fatigue, Maria stood at the head of the table, radiating calm confidence. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice steady and assured, "I know we've taken a hit, but I want to assure you that this setback is temporary. In fact, I believe we can turn this situation to our advantage." She outlined her plan, explaining how they would use this crisis as an opportunity to streamline their operations, to shed some of the less profitable aspects of the business that had been holding them back. She presented a bold vision of a leaner, more agile Reyes Enterprises, one that would be better positioned to weather future storms. As she spoke, Maria could see the doubt in some of their eyes slowly being replaced by curiosity, even excitement. By the end of her presentation, the mood in the room had shifted dramatically. Where there had been despair, there was now cautious optimism. With the board's backing secured, Maria moved on to the next phase of her plan. She called a press conference, facing the media with the same unwavering confidence she had shown the board. "Reyes Enterprises has always been about innovation and adapting to change," she told the assembled reporters. "What you're seeing now is not a company in crisis, but a company evolving. We're excited about the future and the opportunities that lie ahead." Her performance was masterful, turning what could have been a narrative of failure into one of strategic transformation. By the time the markets opened the next day, their stock had begun to rebound, but Maria knew that positive press and a temporary stock rally. She needed to neutralize the threat Antonio posed once and for all, and for that, she would need to use the information information Elena had provided. Over the next few days, Maria carefully laid the groundwork for her counterstrike. She reached out to key investors, not just to reassure them, but to subtly hint at the dirt she had on Antonio. She let it be known in certain circles that she was in possession of information that could be very damaging to her husband's reputation, and by extension, to anyone closely associated with him. The effect was almost immediate. Several of the investors who had pulled out suddenly expressed interest in reinvesting. Others who had been wavering decided to maintain their stakes in the company. The tide was turning, but Maria wasn't content to simply regain lost ground. She wanted to send a clear message to Antonio to show him that she was not to be trifled with, and so she decided to make a move that would hit him where it hurt most: his pride. Using her connections and the leverage provided by Eleanor's discovery, Maria orchestrated a series of events that led to Antonio being publicly ousted from the board of a prestigious charity he had long been associated with. It was a calculated move, designed to isolate him further and chip away at his remaining influence. The news made headlines, and Maria knew it would sting Antonio deeply. His philanthropic work had always been a source of pride for him, a way to burnish his public image. Now, that image was tarnished, and Maria had made sure everyone knew she was the one holding the brunt. As she sat in her office, reading the reports of Antonio's ouster, Maria felt a complex mix of emotions. Part of her felt a grim satisfaction at having outmaneuvered her husband so thoroughly, but there was also a tinge of sadness, a reminder of the love they had once shared and the dreams they had built together. She was pulled from her thoughts by a knock on her door. It was Ramirez, her head of security, looking grey. "Mrs. Reyes, we've just received a threat. It's about your safety." Maria's blood ran cold. "Tell me everything," she said, her voice calm despite the fear gripping her heart. As Ramirez explained the situation, detailing an anonymous message that had been sent to the company threatening Maria's life, she realized that the game had taken an even darker turn. Antonio, it seemed, was not going to go down without a fight. For a moment, Maria allowed herself to feel the full weight of the situation: the lonely nights, the constant vigilance, the strain of maintaining her public persona while fighting. A shadow war with her own husband. It all came crashing down on her. But then, as quickly as it had come, the moment passed. Maria straightened in her chair, her eyes flashing with determination. "Double the security detail," she instructed Ramirez, "and get me everything you can on the source of this threat. If Antonio wants to play dirty, we'll show him just how dirty we can get." As Ramirez left to carry out her orders, Maria turned to look out at the Manila skyline. The sun was setting, painting the sky in brilliant shades of orange and pink. It was beautiful, a reminder of all she was fighting for. She had come too far to back down now. Antonio might have escalated the conflict, but Maria was ready. She had transformed herself from a naive bride into a formidable businesswoman and strategist. She had faced every challenge head-on and emerged stronger. This threat, as serious as it was just another obstacle to overcome, and Maria Reyes was nothing if not an expert at overcoming obstacles. With renewed determination, she turned back to her desk, ready to plan her next move. The game had become deadlier, the stakes higher than ever, but Maria was prepared to do whatever it took to protect herself, her company, and the future she had fought so hard to secure. As night fell over Manila, Maria Reyes sat in her fortified office, surrounded by the trappings of power she had worked so hard to attain. The threat against her life had changed everything, turning what had been a high-stakes business conflict into a dangerous game of cat and mouse. She had spent the last few days in a whirlwind of activity, implementing new security measures, meeting with her legal team, and strategizing with her most trusted advisors. Sleep had become a luxury she could ill afford, but the adrenaline coursing through her veins kept her sharp and focused. As she reviewed the latest security reports, a notification popped up on her computer screen. It was an email from an anonymous sender, the subject line simply reading, "Watch your back." With a steadying breath, Maria clicked to open it. The message was brief but chilling. "You've taken everything from me, Maria. Now I'm going to take everything from you, starting with your precious company. You have 24 hours to resign as CEO, or the world will learn just how dirty Reyes Enterprises was to dismiss the threat as another of Antonio's desperate ploys. But something about the tone, the specific mention of the company's secrets, made her pause. Could Antonio really have damaging information that she wasn't aware of? She quickly called in her head of IT security. "I need you to trace this email," she ordered, forwarding the message. "And I want a full audit of our systems. If there's been any kind of breach, I need to know about it immediately." As her team scrambled to comply, Maria's mind raced with possibilities. She had been so focused on protecting herself from physical threats that she had perhaps underestimated the digital danger. If Antonio had somehow gained access to sensitive company information, the fallout could be catastrophic. Hours ticked by as Maria waited for news, every minute feeling like an eternity. Finally, her IT chief returned, his face grave. "Mrs. Reyes, we've found something. There's been a breach in our secondary backup server. Someone's accessed files dating back several years, including some that were supposedly deleted." Maria felt her stomach drop. Those old files could contain evidence of the very dealings she had been working so hard to distance the company from. If they were made public, all her efforts to reform Reyes Enterprises' image would be undone in an instant. She knew she had to act fast. With less than 12 hours left before the deadline, Maria called an emergency meeting with her crisis management team. As they assembled in her office, she laid out the situation in stark terms. "We have two options," she said, her voice steady despite the turmoil she felt inside. "We can give in to this blackmail, in which case I step down and we hope that's the end of it. Or we can get ahead of this, release the information ourselves on our own terms." Her team looked at her in shock. "Release it ourselves?" her PR director sputtered. "Mrs. Reyes, with all due respect, that would be suicide. The scandal would destroy us." Maria held up a hand to silence him. "Not necessarily. What if we frame it as part of our ongoing commitment to transparency? We acknowledge past mistakes, take full responsibility, and outline the steps we've already taken to change our business practices." As she explained her plan, Maria could see the doubt in her team's eyes slowly being replaced by grudging admiration. It was a risky move, but if it worked, it could neutralize Antonio's threat and potentially even boost the company's reputation in the long run. With the team on board, Maria set the plan in motion. She spent the next few hours drafting a public statement, carefully crafting each word to strike the right balance between confession and redemption. As the deadline approached, she gave the order to publish the statement on the company's website and send it to all major news outlets. The response was immediate and overwhelming. News alerts blared across screens worldwide, social media exploded with commentary, and Maria's phone began ringing off the hook with calls from investors, board members, and journalists. But as the initial shock wore off, something unexpected began to happen. While there was certainly criticism and outrage, there was also a growing chorus of voices praising Reyes Enterprises for its honesty and commitment to change. The company's stock took an initial hit, but it stabilized faster than anyone had predicted. As Maria sat in her office, watching the fallout unfold on multiple screens, she allowed herself a small smile of satisfaction. She had taken Antonio's best shot and not only survived but managed to turn it to her advantage. Her moment of triumph was interrupted by a knock on the door. It was Ramirez, her security chief. "Mrs. Reyes," he said, his voice tight with tension, "we've just received word Mr. Reyes has been in an accident." Maria felt her world tilt on its axis. Despite everything that had happened between them, despite the bitterness and betrayal, Antonio was still her husband. Is he alive?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Ramirez nodded. "He's in the hospital. It's serious, but he's stable. The police are investigating, but early reports suggest his brakes may have been tampered with." The implication hung heavy in the air. Had someone tried to kill Antonio? And if so, was it because of his actions against Maria, or was there more to this tangled web than she knew? As she rushed to the hospital, her security detail in tow, Maria's mind whirled with questions and possibilities. She had thought she was nearing the end of this ordeal, but now it seemed she was entering an even more dangerous phase. At the hospital, Maria was met with chaos. Reporters clamored for a statement. Security guards struggled to maintain order, and amid it all, she caught glimpses of familiar faces, board members, and business associates all jockeying for information. When she was finally allowed into Antonio's room, vulnerable he looked. Hooked up to various machines, his usual vitality dimmed. As she approached his bedside, his eyes fluttered open. "Maria," he croaked, his voice weak. "I didn't think you'd come." She took his hand, surprised by the surge of emotion she felt. "Of course I came," she said softly. "Whatever's happened between us, I never wanted this." Antonio's grip tightened on her hand. "Maria, listen to me," he said, his voice urgent despite its weakness. "This wasn't an accident. There's more going on here than you know. We're both in danger." Maria leaned closer, her heart racing. "What do you mean? Who's behind this?" But before Antonio could answer, his eyes rolled back and the machines around him began to beep frantically. Medical staff rushed in, pushing Maria aside as they worked to stabilize him. In the chaos that followed, Maria found herself ushered out of the room, her mind reeling from Antonio's cryptic warning. As she stood in the hallway, surrounded by the bustle of the hospital, she realized that the game had changed once again. This was no longer just about her and Antonio, about control of the company or personal vendettas. There was a bigger picture she wasn't seeing, a danger that threatened them both. As she waited for news on Antonio's condition, Maria's mind raced with possibilities. Who else could be involved? What larger forces were at play? And most importantly, what was her next move? She knew one thing for certain: she couldn't face this alone. It was time to reach out to her network, to call in favors and gather intelligence. Whatever was coming, Maria Reyes would be ready. With a deep breath, she pulled out her phone and began to make calls. The game wasn't over. In fact, it seemed it was only just beginning. But Maria was determined to see it through to the end, no matter the cost. As she worked, the bustling hospital faded into the background. Maria Reyes, once a naive bride, now a hardened businesswoman and strategist, steeled herself for the challenges ahead. The path forward was uncertain, fraught with danger, but she would navigate it. She had come too far, fought too hard to back down now. The next chapter of her story was about to unfold, and Maria was ready to write it on her own terms. The hospital corridor buzzed with activity as doctors and nurses rushed past, their urgent whispers creating a backdrop of tension. Maria Reyes stood like a statue amidst the chaos, her mind racing even as her body remained still. Antonio's words echoed in her head. "We're both in danger." What did he mean? Who else could be involved in this intricate web of deceit and power? As she pondered these questions, her phone vibrated in her hand. It was a message from Isabella Torres. "Maria, we need to talk. It's urgent. Meet me at the usual place in an hour." Maria glanced at the closed door of Antonio's room, then back at her phone. She knew she couldn't stay at the hospital indefinitely, especially not when there were so many unanswered questions. With a deep breath, she made her decision. "Ramirez," she called to her head of security, who'd been standing vigilantly nearby. "I need to step out for a while. Double the guard on Antonio's room and keep me updated on his condition." As Maria made her way out of the hospital, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was being watched. Every face in the crowd seemed suspicious, every shadow potentially hiding a threat. The weight of the situation pressed down on her, but she refused to let it show. She had come too far to falter now. The usual place was a small, upscale cafe tucked away in one of Manila's quieter neighborhoods. As Maria entered, she spotted Isabella at a corner table, her usually impeccable appearance slightly disheveled, her eyes darting nervously around the room. "Thank you for coming," Isabella said as Maria sat down. "I wasn't sure if you'd be able to get away from the hospital." Maria studied her friend's face, noting the dark circles under her eyes and the slight tremor in her hands. "Isabella, what's going on? You look like you haven't slept in days." Isabella leaned in, her voice barely above a whisper. "It's worse than we thought, Maria. Antonio's accident, it wasn't just about your feud. There's a bigger player involved, someone who's been pulling strings behind the scenes for years." Maria felt her heart rate quicken. "Who?" Isabella glanced around nervously before answering. "Senator Villar. He's not just Antonio's friend and business partner. He's been using Reyes Enterprises as a front for money laundering and other illegal activities. And now that you've been cleaning house, he's getting desperate." The pieces started to fall into place in Maria's mind. The sudden investor pullout, the cyber attacks, even the threat on her life. They all made sense if a powerful political figure was behind them. "How do you know all this?" Maria asked. Her mind, Isabella's eyes filled with tears. Because my husband, the judge, he's been helping cover it up. He told me everything last night. He's terrified, Maria. Villar has dirt on all of them, and he's not afraid to use it. Maria reached across the table, grasping Isabella's trembling hands. Thank you for telling me this. I know how much courage it must have taken. As they continued to talk, Maria's mind was working overtime, formulating plans and discarding them just as quickly. She knew that taking on a senator would be the biggest challenge she had faced yet. This wasn't just about saving her company anymore. It was about exposing a web of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government. After leaving Isabella, Maria didn't return to the hospital or her office. Instead, she directed her driver to take her to a small, nondescript building on the outskirts of the city. It was time to call in a favor from someone she had hoped never to need. The man who answered the door was in his 60s, with graying hair and sharp eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. Maria Reyes, he said, his voice gravelly from years of cigarettes. I wondered when you might show up at my door. Hello, Uncle Ramon, Maria replied, using the affectionate term, even though the man wasn't really her uncle. He had been a friend of her father's, someone Maria had been told she could trust if she ever found herself in real trouble. As she followed him into a cluttered office, Maria took a deep breath. I need your help, and I need to know everything you can tell me about Senator Villar. For the next several hours, Maria listened as Ramon laid out a complex tapestry of political alliances, business deals, and criminal enterprises. Villar, it seemed, had his fingers in many pies, and Reyes Enterprises was just one of many companies he used to further his illegal activities. The problem you face, Maria, Ramon said as he lit another cigarette, is that Villar has made himself almost untouchable. He has dirt on half the politicians in Manila, and the other half owe him favors. Taking him down won't be easy. Maria nodded, her face set in determination. I understand, but I have to try. Not just for me or for Antonio, but for all the people who have suffered because of his corruption. Ramon studied her for a long moment before nodding. All right, I'll help you. But you need to understand that once we start down this path, there's no turning back. Are you prepared for that? Maria thought about everything she had been through, everything she had learned and become over the past months. She thought about Antonio lying in a hospital bed, about Isabella's tear-stained face, about all the lives that had been affected by the greed and corruption of men like Villar. I'm ready, she said, her voice steady and sure. Over the next few days, Maria threw herself into the biggest challenge of her life. By day, she continued to run Reyes Enterprises, putting on a brave face for the employees and the public. But by night, she worked tirelessly with Ramon and a small team of trusted allies, piecing together evidence and building a case against Villar. It was dangerous work. More than once, Maria caught glimpses of unfamiliar cars following her, of strange men watching her house. But she refused to be intimidated. She'd come too far to back down now. As their investigation deepened, Maria began to uncover connections she had never imagined. Villar's influence extended far beyond Manila, reaching into international corporations and even foreign governments. The scope of his corruption was staggering, but with each new piece of evidence, each new connection uncovered, Maria felt herself growing stronger. She was no longer just fighting for her company or her marriage. She was fighting for justice, for the chance to make a real difference in her country. 1 week into their investigation, Maria received a call from the hospital. Antonio was awake and asking for her. Despite her reservations, she knew she had to go. As she entered his room, she was struck by how frail he looked, how vulnerable. Maria, he said, his voice weak but urgent, I need to tell you something about Villar. She sat beside him, taking his hand. I know, Antonio. I know about his involvement with the company, about the money laundering. Antonio's eyes widened in surprise, then filled with a mixture of relief and regret. I'm sorry, he whispered. I never meant for things to go this far. I thought I could handle it, that I could protect you from all of this. Maria felt a surge of complex emotions, anger and pity warring within her. You should have trusted me, Antonio. We could have faced this together from the beginning. He nodded, tears forming in his eyes. You're right. I underestimated you, Maria. I think I've been underestimating you from the day we met. As they talked, Maria felt a shift in their relationship. The anger to fade, replaced by a tentative understanding. They weren't in love anymore. Perhaps they never truly had been, but they were allies now in a fight that was bigger than both of them. Antonio provided Maria with key information about Villar's operations, filling in gaps in their investigation. As she left left the hospital that night, Maria felt a renewed sense of purpose. They were close. She could feel it. Soon, they would have enough evidence to bring Villar down. But Villar wasn't about to go down without a fight. The next morning, Maria woke to news that shook her to her core. Ramon, her trusted advisor and friend, had been found dead in his home, the victim of an apparent heart attack. Maria knew instantly that it was no coincidence. Villar was sending a message, a clear warning of what happened to those who dared to challenge him. For a moment, standing in her kitchen with the news report blaring from the television, Maria felt a wave of fear and doubt wash over her. Was it worth it? Was justice worth risking not just her life, but the lives of those she cared about? But then she thought of Ramon, of his unwavering commitment to doing what was right. She thought of Isabella and her husband, living in fear of Villar's retribution. She thought of all the people whose lives had been affected by Villar's greed and corruption. With a deep breath, Maria straightened her shoulders and reached for her phone. She had calls to make, plans to set in motion. Villar had made his move, and now it was her turn. As she dialed the first number, Maria's mind was clear and focused. She had started this journey as a naive bride, transformed into a cunning businesswoman. And now she was about to become something more, a force for change, a crusader for justice. The final battle was about to begin, and Maria Reyes was ready. Whatever the outcome, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. The sun had barely risen over Manila's skyline when Maria Reyes stepped into her office at Reyes Enterprises. The events of the past few days weighed heavily on her mind, but she refused to let it show. Today was the day she would set her final plan in motion. As she settled behind her desk, Maria's phone buzzed with a message from Isabella. "Are you sure about this? There's no going back once we start." Maria took a deep breath before replying. "I'm sure. It's time to end this once and for all." With steady hands, she opened her laptop and began to type. The document that took shape on her screen was more than just a press release. It was a declaration of war against corruption, a comprehensive expose of Senator Villar's criminal empire, with Reyes Enterprises at its center. As she worked, Maria's mind drifted back to the journey that had brought her to this moment. From the naive bride who had discovered her husband's secret will to the seasoned businesswoman she had become, every step had led her here. The betrayals, the battles, the losses and victories, all of it had prepared her for this final confrontation. Hours ticked by as Maria meticulously laid out the evidence she and her team had gathered. Financial records, witness testimonies, intercepted communications, all carefully presented to paint a damning picture of Villar's activities. She included details of how Reyes Enterprises had been used as a front for money laundering, acknowledging her own unwitting role in the scheme. As she neared the end of the document, Maria paused, her cursor blinking at her. This was her last chance to turn back, to choose a safer path. But the memory of Ramon's death, the fear in Isabella's eyes, the countless lives ruined by Villar's greed, all steeled her resolve. With a final, decisive click, Maria sent the document to her most trusted contacts in the media. Within minutes, her phone began to ring incessantly as journalists clamored for comments and clarification. Maria ignored the calls for now. There would be time for interviews later. Instead, she turned her attention to her next task, preparing for the inevitable backlash. She had barely begun when her office door burst open. It was Ramirez, her head of security, his face pale with urgency. "Mrs. Reyes, we've received a credible threat against your life. We need to move you to a secure location immediately." Maria nodded, having anticipated this. "Activate Protocol Omega," she instructed, referring to a contingency plan she had put in place weeks ago. "And make sure Antonio is protected as well." As Ramirez rushed to comply, Maria took one last look around her office. She had a feeling it would be a while before she saw it again. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity. Maria was whisked away to a safe house on the outskirts of the city, surrounded by a team of security personnel. From there, she watched as her revelations sent shockwaves through Manila's political and business circles. News channels were in a frenzy. Their ticker tapes. Senator Villar implicated in massive corruption scandal. Reyes Enterprises CEO blows whistle on money laundering operation. Government in crisis as more officials linked to Villar's criminal network. Maria's phone buzzed, and constantly with messages from allies and threats from enemies. She responded to neither, focusing instead on coordinating with her legal team and trusted journalists to ensure that the full scope of Villar's crimes was brought to light. As night fell, Maria allowed allowed herself a moment of reflection. She thought of Antonio, still recovering in the hospital, unaware of the storm that had been unleashed. She thought of Isabella, who had risked everything to help expose the truth. And she thought of Ramon, whose sacrifice had given her the final push she needed to see this through. Her moment of quiet was interrupted by an urgent knock on the door. One of her security team entered, his face grim. "Mrs. Reyes, there's something you need to see." He handed her a tablet on which a live news broadcast was playing. Maria's breath caught in her throat as she saw Senator Villar on the screen, his usual polished appearance now disheveled and frantic. "These accusations are false," Villar was saying, his voice shaking with barely controlled rage. "Maria Reyes is a desperate woman trying to save her failing company by smearing my good name. I demand a full retraction and apology, or I will pursue legal action to the fullest extent of the law." As Villar continued his tirade, Maria noticed something in his eyes that she had never seen before: fear. Despite his blustering, Villar knew that his empire was crumbling, and a cornered man was the most dangerous kind. Maria handed the tablet back to the security officer. "Double the guard and be prepared for anything," she instructed. "Villar won't go down without a fight." Over the next few days, Manila became a battleground of information and misinformation. Villar and his allies launched a fierce counterattack, attempting to discredit Maria and anyone associated with her. But for every lie they spread, Maria's team was ready with irrefutable evidence to back up their claims. Public opinion began to shift as more details of Villar's corruption came to light. Protests erupted across the city, with citizens demanding justice and accountability. Government officials scrambled to distance themselves from Villar, while others found themselves caught in the expanding investigation. Through it all, Maria remained in seclusion, coordinating her efforts from the safe house. She gave interviews via secure video links, presenting a calm and determined face to the public, even as the threats against her life intensified. On the fifth day, after her initial revelation, Maria received news that made her heart skip a beat. Antonio had checked himself out of the hospital against medical advice and had disappeared. Despite the security detail assigned to him, he had managed to slip away unnoticed. As Maria grappled with this new development, her phone rang. The number was blocked, but she knew instinctively who it was. "Antonio," she answered, her voice steady despite her racing pulse. "Maria," came the reply, Antonio's voice tight with tension. "I need to see you. It's not safe to talk over the phone, but I have information that could change everything. Can you meet me?" Maria hesitated, her mind working furiously to assess the risks. Could she trust Antonio, or was this a trap set by Villar? In the end, her instincts won out. "All right," she said, "but on my terms. I'll send you the details." After hanging up, Maria turned to Ramirez. "Prepare for extraction," she ordered. "We're moving to location Delta." Hours later, as the sun set over Manila Bay, Maria stood on the balcony of an abandoned warehouse, waiting. She had chosen this location carefully, ensuring multiple escape routes and clear sightlines for her security team. The sound of footsteps made her turn. Antonio emerged from the shadows, looking haggard but determined. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. "Thank you for coming," Antonio said finally, breaking the silence. "I know you have no reason to trust me, but what I'm about to tell you could be the key to bringing Villar down for good." As Antonio began to speak, laying out a complex web of offshore accounts and secret deals that even Maria hadn't uncovered, she felt a shift in the air. This was it, the final piece of the puzzle. With this information, Villar's fate would be sealed. But even as hope surged within her, Maria remained vigilant. She had come too far, sacrificed too much to let her guard down now. The end game was approaching, and she knew that the most dangerous moments often came just before victory. As night fell over the city, Maria and Antonio worked feverishly to compile the new evidence. Tomorrow, they would present it to the authorities. The final battle would begin. Maria looked out over the glittering lights of Manila, the city she had fought so hard to protect. Whatever happened next, she knew that nothing would ever be the same again. But she was ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to see this fight through to the end. The naive bride who had started this journey was gone. In her place stood a woman of strength and determination, a force to be reckoned with. Maria Reyes was ready to write the final chapter of her story, and it would be one for the history books. The sun rose over Manila, casting a golden glow across the city's skyline. For Maria Reyes, standing at the window of her secure location, it felt like the dawn of a new era. Today was the day she would present the final evidence against Senator Villa, the culmination of months of struggle and sacrifice. As she turned away from the window, Maria caught sight of her reflection in a nearby mirror. The woman staring back at her was a far cry from the naive bride who had unknowingly stepped into a world of corruption and deceit. Her eyes held a steely determination, her posture radiating confidence and strength. She was ready for what lay ahead. Antonio entered the room, his face drawn with fatigue, but his eyes alert. "The team is ready," he said. "We've triple-checked everything. This evidence is bulletproof." Maria nodded, feeling a mix of anticipation and trepidation. "Let's go over it one more time," she said, moving to the table where stacks of documents and laptops were spread out. For the next hour, Maria and Antonio meticulously reviewed the information they had compiled. Financial records showing the intricate web of Villa's money laundering operations. Witness testimonies corroborating the senator's involvement in various illegal activities, encrypted communications detailing bribes and threats. It was a damning collection of evidence, one that would be impossible for even Villa's most ardent supporters to ignore. As they worked, Maria couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought them to this point. The discovery of Antonio's secret will seem like a lifetime ago. Since then, she had transformed from a trophy wife into a formidable businesswoman, and now an anti-corruption crusader. The path had been fraught with danger and betrayal, but it had also forged her into someone stronger than she ever thought possible. A knock on the door interrupted their review. It was Ramirez, Maria's head of security. "Mrs. Reyes, it's time. The press conference is set to begin in an hour." Maria took a deep breath, steeling herself for what was to come. "All right," she said, her voice steady. "Let's finish this." The drive to the press conference location was tense. Maria sat in the back of an armored vehicle, surrounded by security personnel. Through the tinted windows, she could see the streets of Manila passing by, people going about their daily lives, unaware that their world was about to be shaken to its core. As they neared their destination, Maria noticed a commotion ahead. A crowd had gathered outside the building where the press conference was to be held. Some held signs supporting her, others denouncing her as a liar. The divide in public opinion was stark, a testament to Villa's influence and the effectiveness of his smear campaign. The vehicle came to a stop, and Ramirez turned to Maria. "Are you ready for this?" he asked, concern evident in his voice. Maria met his gaze, her resolve unwavering. "I've been ready for this since the day I discovered the truth," she replied. "Let's go." As Maria stepped out of the vehicle, the crowd's reaction was immediate and intense. Cheers and jeers mingled in the air as she made her way towards the building, flanked by her security team. Journalists shouted questions, cameras flashed, but Maria remained focused, her eyes fixed on the entrance ahead. Inside, the press room was a hive of activity. Reporters jostled for position. Camera crews made last-minute adjustments to their equipment. At the front of the room, a podium stood ready, microphones bristling from its surface. Maria took her place behind the podium, acutely aware of the hundreds of eyes fixed upon her. She could feel the weight of expectation in the room, the tension almost palpable. This was the moment of truth. Taking a deep breath, Maria began to speak. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Thank you all for coming. Today, I stand before you not just as the CEO of Reyes Enterprises, but as a citizen of the Philippines who believes in justice and accountability." As Maria laid out the evidence against Senator Villa, the room fell into a hushed silence. She presented document after document, testimony after testimony, each piece of evidence more damning than the last. She spoke of the complex money laundering schemes, the bribery, the threats against those who dared to speak out. For too long, we have allowed corruption to eat away at the foundations of our society. We have turned a blind eye to the actions of those in power, convincing ourselves that this is simply the way things are. Today, I say no more. Just as Maria was reaching the climax of her presentation, a commotion erupted at the back of the room. Heads turned as Senator Villa himself burst through the doors, flanked by his own security detail. "This is slander!" Villa shouted. shouted, his face red with anger. "I will not stand by while my reputation is dragged through the mud by a desperate woman clinging to power." For a moment, chaos reigned. Reporters shouted questions. Security personnel from both sides tensed for confrontation, but Maria remained calm, her gaze locked on Villar. "Senator," she said, her voice cutting through the noise, "I'm glad you're here. Perhaps you'd like to address these allegations directly." Villar stormed towards the podium, but Maria stood her ground. As he reached her, she calmly held out a document. "Perhaps you can explain this offshore account in your name, Senator, or these communications detailing your involvement in the bribery of government officials." The color drained from Villar's face as he looked at the document. For a moment, his carefully constructed facade cracked, revealing the desperation beneath. Then, in a move that shocked everyone present, he lunged for Maria. What happened next was a blur of motion. Maria's security team moved to intercept Villar, while his own men tried to intervene. In the chaos, Maria found herself pushed aside, stumbling against the podium. As she regained her footing, Maria's eyes locked with Villar's. In that moment, she saw the truth of the man behind the powerful facade, a cornered animal lashing out in desperation. Suddenly, a shot rang out. The room erupted into screams as people dove for cover. Maria felt a sharp pain in her shoulder and looked down to see a spreading red stain on her blouse. Time seemed to slow as Maria sank to her knees. Through the haze of shock and pain, she was dimly aware of more shouting, of bodies rushing around her. She saw Villar being tackled too, the ground, a gun skittering across the floor. As darkness began to creep in at the edges of her vision, Maria's last conscious thought was of the journey that had brought her to this moment. From a naive bride to a woman willing to risk everything for the truth. She had done what needed to be done. Now it was up to others to finish what she had started. The world faded to black, the chaos of the room giving way to a deep, enveloping silence. When Maria next opened her eyes, she found herself in a hospital room. The steady beep of monitors filled the air, and sunlight streamed through a nearby window. As her vision cleared, she saw Antonio sitting by her bedside, his face etched with worry and fatigue. "Welcome back," he said softly, noticing her stirring. "You had us all worried for a while there." Maria tried to speak, but her throat was dry. Antonio quickly offered her some water, helping her take small sips. As the cool liquid soothed her parched throat, memories of the press conference came flooding back. "Villar," she managed to croak out. "What happened?" Antonio's expression hardened. "He's been arrested," he replied. "The evidence we presented, combined with his actions at the press conference, left the authorities with no choice. It's over, Maria. We won." Relief washed over Maria, but it was quickly followed by a realization of the magnitude of what they had accomplished. "And the company?" she asked. "The other people involved?" "It's all coming out," Antonio said. "Your revelations opened the floodgates. Investigations are underway, arrests are being made, the whole corrupt system is being dismantled." As Antonio filled her in on the events of the past few days, Maria felt a complex mix of emotions. Pride in what she had achieved, sorrow for the price that had been paid, and a deep, bone-weary exhaustion. Over the next few weeks, as Maria recovered in the hospital, she watched as the world she had known crumbled and began to rebuild itself. News reports detailed the ongoing investigations, the arrests of powerful figures, the reforms being implemented in the wake of the scandal. Visitors came and went, some offering congratulations, others seeking advice or forgiveness. Isabella came, tearfully thanking Maria for her courage and revealing that her husband had decided to come clean about his own involvement in Villar's schemes. Even as she was lauded as a hero by many, Maria knew that the road ahead would not be easy. Reyes Enterprises would need to be restructured, its operations scrutinized to root out any lingering corruption. There would be legal battles to face, reputations to rebuild. But as she stood at the window of her hospital room, looking out over the city she had fought so hard to protect, Maria felt a sense of peace. She had started this journey as a victim, blindsided by betrayal and deceit. She was ending it as a victor, having not only survived, but triumphed over the forces that had sought to destroy her. The day Maria was released from the hospital, a crowd had gathered outside. As she emerged, leaning slightly on Antonio for support, a cheer went up. People waved signs thanking her for her courage, calling her a hero. For a moment, Maria was overwhelmed by the outpouring of support. Then, straightening her shoulders, she raised a hand to wave to the crowd. This was not the end, she knew, but a new beginning. There was still work to be done, a company to lead, a country to help rebuild. As she made her way to the waiting car, Maria caught sight of her reflection in the polished surface. The woman looking back at her was not the naive bride who had walked down the aisle at the Manila Cathedral, nor was she the hardened businesswoman who had uncovered a web of corruption. She was something new, something forged in the fires of adversity and tempered by determination. Maria Reyes had transformed herself, and in doing so, she had transformed her world. As the car pulled away from the curb, carrying her towards an uncertain but hopeful future, Maria allowed herself a small smile. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she was ready to face them, armed with the strength and wisdom she had gained on this incredible journey. The streets of Manila passed by outside. The car window, a city forever changed by the events of the past months. And at the heart of that change was a woman who had refused to be a victim, who had instead chosen to fight for justice, no matter the cost. Maria Reyes had written her own story, and it was one that would be remembered for generations to come. The boardroom of Reyes Enterprises hummed with anticipation as Maria Reyes took her seat at the head of the table. 6 months had passed since the explosive press conference that had brought down Senator Villar and exposed a vast network of corruption. In that time, Maria had overseen a complete overhaul of the company, rooting out every trace of illegal activity and implementing stringent new ethical guidelines. As she looked around the table at the faces of her executive team, some familiar and some new, Maria felt a sense of pride in how far they had come. The road to redemption had been challenging, but Reyes Enterprises was emerging stronger and more transparent than ever before. "Good morning, everyone," Maria began, her voice steady and confident. "Today marks a significant milestone in our company's history. We're here to finalize our plans for the launch of the Reyes Foundation for Corporate Integrity." A murmur of approval rippled through the room. The foundation had been Maria's brainchild, born from her desire to turn the painful lessons of the past into a force for positive change in the business world. As Maria outlined the foundation's objectives, focusing on promoting ethical business practices and supporting whistleblowers, she couldn't help but reflect on the journey that had brought her to this point. The naive bride who had discovered her husband's secret will seemed like a distant memory now, replaced by a woman who had faced down corruption at the highest levels and emerged victorious. The meeting progressed smoothly, with each department head presenting their contributions to the foundation's lawn. As they discussed outreach programs and educational initiatives, Maria felt a renewed sense of purpose. They weren't just rebuilding a company, they were setting a new standard for corporate responsibility in the Philippines. As the meeting drew to a close, Maria's assistant entered the room, a look of urgency on her face. "I'm sorry to interrupt, Mrs. Reyes, but there's a situation that requires your immediate attention." Excusing herself, Maria followed her assistant out of the boardroom. In the hallway, she found Antonio waiting for her, his face grave. "Maria, we've just received word. The Supreme Court has agreed to hear Villar's appeal." Maria felt a chill run down her spine. Despite the mountain of evidence against him, Villar had been fighting his conviction tooth and nail, using every legal maneuver at his disposal. This latest development could potentially undo months of progress. "When is the hearing?" Maria asked, her mind already racing with potential strategies. 3 weeks from now," Antonio replied. "Our legal team is already preparing, but Villar's lawyers are claiming they have new evidence that could exonerate him." Maria nodded, her jaw set with determination. "All right, cancel my afternoon appointments. We need to meet with the lawyers immediately." As they made their way to the legal department, Maria's phone buzzed with a message from Isabella. "Have you heard the news? We need to talk. Meet me at the usual place in an hour." Maria quickly replied, confirming the meeting. Villar's new strategy, it would be Isabella, whose husband's testimony had been crucial in the original trial. The next few hours were a whirlwind of activity. Maria huddled with her legal team, going over every detail of the case. Against Villar, they analyzed potential weaknesses in their arguments, strategized responses to possible new evidence, and discussed ways to reinforce the credibility credibility of their witnesses. By the time Maria left for her meeting with Isabella, her mind was buzzing with legal jargon and strategy. The quiet cafe where they met felt like a different world, far removed from the high-stakes legal battle they were facing. Isabella was already there when Maria arrived, nervously stirring a cup of coffee. As Maria slid into the seat across from her, she could see the strain on her friend's face. "Thank you for coming," Isabella said, her voice low. "I didn't want to say too much over the phone, but I've heard rumors about what Villar's team is planning. They're going to try to discredit you personally, Maria. They're digging into your past, looking for anything they can use to paint you as untrustworthy." Maria felt a flicker of anger, quickly suppressed. She had expected Villar to fight dirty, but the idea of him prying into her personal life still stung. "Do you know what specifically they're looking for?" Isabella shook her head. "Not exactly, but I've heard whispers about your family, your life before you married Antonio. They're desperate, Maria. They'll use anything they can find." As they continued to talk, Maria's mind raced with possibilities. Her life before marrying Antonio had been ordinary, even boring by most standards, but she knew that in the hands of skilled manipulators, even the most innocent details could be twisted into something sinister. Leaving the cafe, Maria felt a renewed sense of urgency. She needed to be proactive, to anticipate Villar's moves and counter them before they could do any damage. As she walked back to her office, she began to formulate a plan. Over the next few days, Maria threw herself into preparation for the upcoming legal battle. She worked closely with her PR team to craft a narrative that would preemptively address any attacks on her character. They released a series of interviews and articles detailing Maria's background, her rise through the corporate world, and her commitment to ethics and transparency. At the same time, Maria delved deep into her own past, examining every aspect of her life with a critical eye. She reached out to old friends and colleagues, warning them that they might be contacted by Villar's team and urging them to be cautious about what they said. As the date of the Supreme Court hearing drew closer, the pressure began to mount. Maria found herself working late into the night, poring over legal documents and strategy papers. The strain was beginning to show, not just on her, but on everyone involved in the case. One evening, as Maria was preparing to leave the office well past midnight, she found Antonio waiting for her by the elevator. His face was etched with concern. "Maria, we need to talk," he said, his voice soft but insistent. They made their way to a small conference room where Antonio gently but firmly confronted her about the toll the case was taking. "You can't keep pushing yourself like this," he said. "You're no good to anyone if you burn out before we even get to court." Maria started to protest, but Antonio held up a hand to stop her. "I know how important this is," he continued. "Believe me, I want to see Villar brought to justice as much as you do. But we need you at your best, Maria. The company needs you. I need you." His words hit home, and Maria felt a wave of emotion wash over her. For all they had been through, all the betrayals and struggles, Antonio was still here, still fighting by her side. In that moment, she realized that somewhere along the way, their relationship had transformed into something new, a partnership forged in adversity. Taking a deep breath, Maria nodded. "You're right," she admitted. "I've been so focused on the case that I've lost sight of everything else. Thank you for reminding me." As they left the office together, Maria felt a shift in her perspective. Yes, the upcoming hearing was crucial, but it wasn't the end-all and be-all. She had built something important with Reyes Enterprises, had started to make real change in the business world. That work needed to continue, regardless of what happened in court. The next morning, Maria called a meeting with her executive team. She outlined a plan to delegate more of her day-to-day responsibilities, allowing her to focus on the legal case without neglecting the company's ongoing operations. Her team responded with enthusiasm, eager to step up and shoulder more of the burden. As the days ticked down to the hearing, Maria found a new balance in her life. She still worked hard, still poured herself into preparation, but she also made time for other things, for the foundation launch, for strategy sessions on the company's future direction. The night before the hearing, Maria stood on the balcony of her penthouse apartment, looking out over the twinkling lights of Manila. She thought about how far she had come, from the young woman who had walked into a web of deceit to the leader she was today. Whatever happened in court tomorrow, she knew she had already won in the ways that truly mattered. As she turned to go back inside, Maria caught sight of her reflection in the glass door. The woman looking back at her was strong, determined, and unafraid. She was ready for whatever challenges lay ahead, ready to face Villar and his team head-on. Tomorrow would bring its own battles, its own triumphs and setbacks. But tonight, Maria allowed herself a moment of peace, a quiet acknowledgement of all she had accomplished. The naive bride was long gone, replaced by a woman who had faced the worst the world could throw at her and emerged stronger for it. With a small smile, Maria stepped back into her apartment. There was still work to be done, preparations to finalize, but as she settled in for one last review of her testimony, she felt a sense of calm certainty. Whatever happened tomorrow, she would face it with the same determination and integrity that had brought her this far. The stage was set, the players were in place. Tomorrow, the final act would begin, and Maria Reyes was ready to take center stage. The morning of the Supreme Court hearing dawned bright and clear over Manila. Maria Reyes stood before her mirror, adjusting her suit one last time. The woman reflected back at her exuded confidence and determination, a far cry from the naive bride who had first stumbled upon her husband's secrets. As she made her way downstairs, Maria found Antonio waiting for her in the living room. Their eyes met, and a moment of understanding passed between them. So much had changed since their wedding day, but here they were, still standing together in the face of adversity. "Ready?" Antonio asked, offering her a supportive smile. Maria nodded, her voice steady. "As ready as I'll ever be. Let's finish this." The drive to the Supreme Court was tense but quiet. Manila's streets were already bustling with activity, but inside their secure vehicle, Maria and Antonio were in a world of their own. Maria used the time to center herself mentally, reviewing key points of her testimony and steeling herself for the challenges ahead. As they approached the courthouse, Maria could see the crowd gathered outside. Supporters waved signs and chanted her name, while others held placards denouncing her as a liar and a fraud. The division in public opinion was stark, a testament to the high stakes of this case. Security ushered them through a side entrance, away from the clamoring crowds and flashing cameras. Inside, the atmosphere was hushed and tense. Legal teams huddled in corners, going over last-minute strategies. Journalists scribbled notes, their eyes darting around for any hint of a story. Maria caught sight of Senator Villar across the room, surrounded by his high-powered legal team. Their eyes met for a brief moment, and Maria felt a chill run down her spine at the cold hatred she saw there. But she refused to be intimidated. She had faced down worse and emerged victorious. As they took their seats in the courtroom, Maria felt a hand squeeze her shoulder. She turned to see Isabella offering a supportive smile. "You've got this," her friend whispered. "We're all behind you." The proceedings began with opening statements from both sides. Villar's lawyer painted a picture of a vindictive woman out for revenge, willing to fabricate evidence and destroy reputations to get what she wanted. Maria listened calmly, knowing that her truth would speak louder than any accusations. When it was her turn to testify, Maria took a deep breath and approached the stand. As she swore to tell the truth, she looked out over the courtroom. Her gaze swept past Villar and his team, past the journalists scribbling furiously in their notebooks, and landed on Antonio. His encouraging nod gave her the final boost of confidence she needed. For the next several hours, Maria laid out her case. With precision and clarity, she detailed the trail of corruption she had uncovered, backed up by meticulous documentation and corroborating testimonies. She spoke of the threats she had faced, the attempts on her life, and the ultimate confrontation that had led to this moment. Villar's lawyers attempted to shake her testimony, probing for inconsistencies and trying to cast doubt on her character. But Maria remained unflappable. For every accusation, she had a reasoned response. For every attempt to discredit her, she countered with irrefutable evidence. As the day wore on, Maria could sense a shift in the courtroom. The skepticism that had greeted her, even some of Villar's supporters, seemed shaken by the weight of evidence she presented. The climax came when Villar's team presented their supposed new evidence, a series of doctored emails that purported to show Maria conspiring to frame the senator. For a moment, the courtroom buzzed with excitement, but Maria had been prepared for this. With calm precision, she and her legal team dismantled the fake emails, demonstrating conclusively that they had been fabricated. The revelation was a turning point, casting doubt on every aspect of Villar's defense. As the final arguments were made, Maria felt a sense of quiet triumph. She had done everything she could. Now it was up to the court to decide. The wait for the verdict was excruciating. Days stretched into weeks as the justices deliberated. Maria threw herself back into her work at Reyes Enterprises, but the tension of waiting was always there, an undercurrent to every moment. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the call came. The court was ready to announce its decision. Once again, Maria found herself in the packed courtroom, her heart racing as she waited to hear her fate. As the Chief Justice began to speak, she felt Antonio's hand slip into hers, a silent gesture of support. In the matter of the people of the Philippines versus Senator Eduardo Villar, this court finds the defendant guilty on all counts. The courtroom erupted in chaos. Cheers and gasps mingled as people reacted to the verdict. Maria sat still, letting the words wash over her. They had won. The truth had prevailed. In the days that followed, Maria found herself at the center of a media storm. Interviews, press conferences, congratulatory calls from around the world. It was all a blur, but through it all, she remained focused on what mattered most, the future. With Villar's conviction upheld, the way was clear for real change in the Philippines' business and political landscape. Maria threw herself into the work of the Reyes Foundation for Corporate Integrity with renewed vigor. She spoke at conferences, worked with lawmakers to draft new anti-corruption legislation, and mentored young entrepreneurs on the importance of ethical business practices. Reyes Enterprises, too, entered a new era of growth and innovation. With its reputation for integrity firmly established, the company attracted new partners and investors from around the world. Maria oversaw a series of strategic expansions, always with an eye towards sustainable, ethical growth. As for her personal life, Maria found herself re-evaluating her relationship with Antonio. The trials they had faced together had forged a new kind of bond between them, one based on mutual respect and shared values rather than the superficial attraction of their early days. One evening, as they sat on the balcony of their home, looking out over the Manila skyline, Antonio turned to her with a serious expression. "Maria," he said softly, "I know we can never go back to how things were before. Too much has happened. But I want you to know how proud I am of you, of everything you've accomplished, and I'm grateful that you've allowed me to be a part of it." Maria studied his face, seeing the sincerity in his eyes. "We've both changed," she replied. "Maybe it's time we start fresh, see where this new version of us might lead." As they sat there, talking late into the night about their hopes for the future, Maria felt a sense of peace settle over her. The journey had been long and fraught with danger, but she had emerged stronger, wiser, and more determined than ever. The naive bride who had once been blindsided by her husband's deception was gone. In her place stood a woman who had faced down corruption at the highest levels, who had risked everything for the truth, and who now stood poised to make a real difference in the world. As the lights of Manila twinkled below them, Maria Reyes looked to the future with hope and determination. She had written her own story, one of transformation, resilience, and ultimate triumph, and she knew that the best chapters were still to come.